What if I told you that the Holocaust was not a force of nature, not a disaster that descended on the world the way a hurricane descends, impersonal and inevitable and beyond any human agency to redirect? What if I told you that every stage of the Holocaust, every escalation of its scope and scale and brutality, required a specific decision made by a specific person or a group of people on a specific day, and that those decisions, in many cases, could have been made differently? The popular understanding of the Holocaust treats it too often as a single catastrophic event, something that happened in the past, rather than something that was built, choice by choice, through a sequence of decisions that each crossed a threshold that had not been crossed before. The Holocaust was assembled. It was expanded. It was enabled from outside and resisted from inside. And at each point in its development, human beings made choices that determined whether the murder would continue, accelerate, slow, or stop. Tonight, we're going to go through 25 of those decisions. Not all of the decisions that shaped the Holocaust, because the complete accounting would require a library and a lifetime, but 25 of the most consequential, the decisions at which history most clearly turned, the moments when the scale and the character and the geographic reach of the murder changed because a specific set of human beings made a specific choice. Some of these decisions were made by the architects of the genocide. Some were made by the governments that stood aside and let it happen. Some were made by the individuals who tried to stop it. Some were made by the victims themselves, in conditions of impossible constraint. Every decision we discuss tonight is documented. Every person named made real choices in real circumstances with real consequences. We examine these decisions not to reduce the Holocaust to a sequence of policy choices, which would be a morally inadequate framework for understanding the greatest crime of the modern era. We examine them because understanding the Holocaust as a human project, built by human decisions and enabled by human failures, is the only kind of understanding that carries the moral weight this history demands. The Holocaust that was inevitable cannot teach us anything. The Holocaust that was assembled decision by decision, through choices that could in principle have been made differently, teaches us everything we need to know about what human beings are capable of and what vigilance against repetition actually requires. Before we begin, please subscribe and give this video a like. This kind of serious, documented, morally demanding historical content needs your support to reach the people who should hear it. Now get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let your body settle into the familiar weight of the dark. We start with the decision that made all the others possible. Decision 1, January 30th, 1933. President Hindenburg appoints Hitler Chancellor of Germany, opening the door to everything that follows. Every catastrophe has a beginning. Not a single moment of explosion, but a specific decision that opened a door through which everything else eventually walked. For the Holocaust, that opening decision occurred on January 30th, 1933, in the office of German President Paul von Hindenburg, when the 85-year-old former field marshal and war hero of the First World War appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. That single appointment set in motion a 12-year sequence of events that would culminate in the deaths of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others, in a war that killed between 70 and 85 million people worldwide, and in the complete destruction of a Germany that the men who made the appointment had imagined they were protecting. The decision was not made by a fanatic. Paul von Hindenburg was a conservative Prussian aristocrat and military commander who personally despised Hitler, whom he referred to privately as the Bohemian Corporal, a double contempt that noted Hitler's Austrian origin and his First World War rank. Hindenburg had refused to appoint Hitler Chancellor on multiple occasions during 1932, and his refusals have been genuine. He objected to Hitler's personality, to the street violence of the Nazi brown shirts, to the Nazi Party's working-class electoral base, and to what he considered the movement's lack of the aristocratic dignity appropriate to serious governance. His objections were those of a Prussian military aristocrat contemptuous of a vulgar political upstart, not the objections of a principled defender of democratic values. What changed in January 1933 was the political calculation of the conservative establishment that surrounded Hindenburg, led most influentially by former Chancellor Franz von Papen, a man whose political ambition significantly exceeded his political wisdom. Von Papen and his circle had developed a theory about the Nazi Party that has gone down in history as one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in modern political history. They believed they could appoint Hitler as chancellor, surround him with experienced conservative cabinet ministers who would control the actual substance of policy, and use the Nazi Party's mass electoral support as a vehicle for conservative nationalist governance, while keeping the unpredictable Hitler himself caged within the constitutional framework of the Weimar Republic. Von Papen reportedly told a colleague in January 1933 that within 2 months they would have pushed Hitler into a corner so tight that he would squeak. His colleague replied, with perhaps the greatest understatement in recorded history, that he had never heard a more impudent political judgment. The conservative establishment's miscalculation rested on 3 specific errors of political judgment that proved fatal. First, they underestimated Hitler's intelligence and his understanding of political power. Hitler had spent years studying the mechanics of mass politics, the techniques of propaganda, the levers of institutional power, and the psychology of political manipulation, and he was considerably more sophisticated in his understanding of these things than the aristocratic conservatives who imagined they could control him. Second, they underestimated the degree to which the Nazi movement's ideology would translate into concrete policy once power was achieved. They had assumed that the anti-Semitism, the authoritarianism, and the racial nationalism of Nazi ideology were electoral postures that would moderate in the face of the practical requirements of governing a modern European state. They were wrong. The ideology was the plan. Third, and most fundamentally, they underestimated the degree to which the constitutional framework they believed would constrain Hitler was itself vulnerable to the kind of determined, systematic dismantling that the new chancellor immediately began. Hitler dismantled the constitutional framework through a sequence of moves that took approximately 6 months, and that were enabled at every point by the conservative establishment's continued willingness to give him the benefit of the doubt. The Reichstag fire decree of February 28, 1933, issued in response to the Reichstag fire that the Nazis exploited and may have organized, suspended the civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution indefinitely. The Enabling Act of March 23, 1933, passed with the votes of the conservative parties who had been promised that Hitler would use it moderately, gave the cabinet the power to legislate without the Reichstag, effectively ending parliamentary democracy. The Night of the Long Knives of June 30, 1934, eliminated potential rivals within the Nazi movement and assassinated several conservative politicians, including the former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, demonstrating that the conservative establishment had no protection against a chancellor who was willing to use murder as a political tool. The merger of the offices of president and chancellor following Hindenburg's death in August 1934 completed the construction of the dictatorship. The lessons of the appointment of January 30, 1933 are not primarily about Hitler himself. They are about the people who brought him to power and the specific errors of judgment they made. They underestimated a dangerous demagogue because of class condescension. They sacrificed democratic norms to achieve short-term political objectives. They assumed that institutional frameworks would constrain a political actor who had explicitly announced his contempt for those frameworks. These are not errors unique to the specific historical moment of Weimar Germany. They are errors that recur throughout political history whenever established elites decide that they can manage a dangerous populist movement by incorporating it into existing power structures. Without the appointment of January 30, 1933, there is no Third Reich. Without the Third Reich, there is no systematic persecution of Jewish Germans. Without that persecution, there is no Holocaust. The entire catastrophic sequence begins with this decision, made by men who thought they knew better than history would ultimately judge them. And speaking of decisions made by people who thought they could manage what they were enabling, let's talk about the legal architecture that transformed political persecution into racial extermination law. Decision 2, September 15, 1935. Hitler announces the Nuremberg Laws, formally creating two tiers of humanity in German law by September 1935, when Hitler announced the Nuremberg Laws at the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. Jewish people in Germany had already endured 2.5 years of escalating persecution. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service of April 1933 had removed Jewish people from government employment. Dozens of subsequent decrees had progressively restricted Jewish access to the professions, to universities, to public spaces, and to participation in cultural life. The April 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses, the pervasive street violence of the SA, and the systematic social humiliation of Jewish Germans had created a daily experience of targeted persecution that was already driving immigration. The Nuremberg Laws announced in September 1935 were therefore not the beginning of Nazi anti-Semitic policy, but its formal legal crystallization into a permanent racial architecture. What the Nuremberg Laws did was qualitatively different from everything that had preceded them. The preceding years of persecution had been applied through a combination of new legislation and administrative discretion, creating conditions that were severe but that a hopeful observer might have imagined could be moderated if the political conditions changed. The Nuremberg Laws eliminated that possibility. They formally stripped German Jews of their citizenship through the Reich citizenship law, creating a category of Jewish subject permanently excluded from the civic life of the state. They formally prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews through the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, codifying the racial separation that the preceding years of social pressure had been attempting to enforce. And they provided a formal legal definition of who is Jewish based on the ancestry of grandparents, making Jewishness a biological category determined by birth rather than by religious practice or self-identification, an inescapable designation that no conversion, no assimilation, and no demonstration of German cultural identity could overcome. The speed and circumstances of the law's drafting reveal something important about how the Nazi state operated. Hitler had announced at the beginning of the Nuremberg rally that a special session of the Reichstag would be held during the rally to pass legislation addressing the Jewish question. The Reich Ministry of Justice officials who were required to draft this legislation had less than 48 hours to produce it. They worked through 2 nights, producing multiple drafts of different levels of comprehensiveness, and presented the options to Hitler for selection. He chose the most radical version available. The haste, the theatrical announcement at a mass political rally, and the personal selection of maximum radicalism by the head of state were all characteristic of a decision-making style that combined ideological commitment with political instinct. The immediate consequences of the Nuremberg Laws were felt most immediately in the acceleration of immigration. The formal legal denationalization of German Jews removed the last basis for the hope that persistence in Germany would eventually produce a return to the status they had held before 1933. Those who had been warning that the situation would not improve now had definitive legal evidence to support their warnings. The immigration that had been occurring since 1933 intensified. Approximately 20,000 people emigrated in 1935 alone, adding to the approximately 60,000 who had left in the preceding 2 years. The international response to the Nuremberg Laws was largely inadequate. Several countries expressed diplomatic disapproval. Press coverage was extensive and generally condemnatory. But no government imposed sanctions. No government modified its refugee admission policies to accommodate the increased immigration pressure, and no international institution challenged the legal legitimacy of the laws. The League of Nations did not act. The democracies calculated that internal German policy was Germany's affair and that diplomatic confrontation over it carried risks they were not prepared to accept. This international response, or rather non-response, to the Nuremberg Laws sent a signal to the Nazi leadership that would be received and noted. The formal legalization of racial persecution in one of Europe's major states generated condemnation without consequence. This pattern of the international community expressing moral disapproval while taking no effective action would repeat itself at Kristallnacht, at the invasion of Poland, at the Wannsee Conference, and at every subsequent escalation until the military defeat of Germany in 1945 ended the killing because it ended the state conducting it. The Nuremberg Laws also created the administrative infrastructure that subsequent stages of persecution would require. The formal legal definition of Jewishness established by the laws became the classification system used for every subsequent measure, for registration requirements, for the identification systems applied during deportation operations, for the demographic accounting of Jewish populations across occupied Europe. The bureaucratic apparatus of the final solution was built on the classification system that the Nuremberg Laws established. Every person deported to Treblinka or Auschwitz was deported as a Jew under the definition first codified in September 1935. And speaking of the international context that enabled subsequent escalations, let's discuss the diplomatic catastrophe that gave Hitler his most consequential territorial gift and the confidence to keep escalating. Decision 3, September 30th, 1938. Britain and France signed the Munich Agreement, teaching Hitler that escalation has no cost. The Munich Agreement of September 29th to 30th, 1938, in which the British and French governments agreed to Germany's annexation of the Sudetenland territory of Czechoslovakia, is remembered primarily as the defining moment of appeasement, the event most associated with Neville Chamberlain's phrase "peace for our time," and as a strategic catastrophe that brought the Second World War 1 year closer without preventing it. But its specific and often underappreciated consequences for the Holocaust are among the most consequential of any diplomatic decision in the 20th century, and understanding those consequences requires examining not only what Munich gave Germany militarily, but what it taught the Nazi leadership about the risks and costs of escalation. The Sudetenland crisis had developed through 1938 with increasing speed and threatening drama. Hitler had demanded the annexation of the German-speaking border regions of Czechoslovakia, threatening war if his demands were refused, and receiving the enthusiastic support of the Sudeten German population that had been organized into a pro-Nazi political movement. Czechoslovakia had a strong defensive position, a well-trained military, defensive fortifications in the Sudetenland specifically built over years to resist German attack, and treaty commitments from France and the Soviet Union. An armed defense of Czechoslovakia would have been militarily serious, and its outcome was genuinely uncertain. Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister Daladier flew to Germany to negotiate with Hitler, and at Munich on the night of September 29th to 30th, they agreed to everything he had demanded. The Sudetenland would be ceded to Germany. Czechoslovakia's defensive system would be dismantled without a shot fired. In exchange, Hitler signed a piece of paper saying this was his last territorial demand. The paper was displayed at Heston Aerodrome. The phrase "peace for our time" was spoken. 6 months later, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The military significance of Munich was enormous and immediate. Germany acquired the Sudetenland's entire defensive fortification system, which had been constructed at enormous expense over years specifically to resist German attack. Germany acquired the Skoda Arms Works, one of the largest and most productive armaments manufacturing facilities in Europe. Germany acquired approximately 35 Czech military divisions worth of equipment. The conquest of the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 added additional industrial capacity, military equipment, and strategic territory to Germany's resources. Every tank, every artillery piece, and every rifle that entered German service from the Czech factories contributed to the military capacity that Germany would use in the subsequent war. But for the Holocaust specifically, Munich's most important consequence was psychological and political rather than military. What Hitler and the Nazi leadership learned from Munich was a specific and actionable lesson, that the Western democracies would not, in the end, draw a line and hold it. That expressions of moral disapproval and diplomatic protest would not be backed by military force. That each demand, no matter how extreme, could be pressed to the point where the democracies would calculate that the cost of resisting was higher than the cost of conceding. That escalation, in other words, had no effective ceiling imposed by external constraint. This lesson was applied directly to anti-Jewish policy. 6 weeks after Munich, the November 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom, the most extensive anti-Jewish violence yet organized by the Nazi state, occurred in Germany and Austria. The international condemnation was strong. Several countries recalled their ambassadors. American President Roosevelt expressed his shock publicly. And absolutely nothing changed in terms of substantive policy response. The Western governments condemned Kristallnacht and maintained their existing immigration quotas, their existing diplomatic relationships with Germany, their existing unwillingness to impose meaningful economic or political costs on the Nazi regime for its treatment of Jewish people. The connection between Munich and the subsequent acceleration of anti-Jewish persecution is not speculative. It is documented in the internal deliberations of the Nazi leadership, which consistently assessed the international community's likely response to specific actions and consistently found that the assessment was disapproval without consequence. Munich taught them that the lesson applied not just to territorial demands but to domestic persecution. The international community would watch and condemn and do nothing. And they were right. And speaking of the specific event that marked the decisive escalation of anti-Jewish violence in Germany, let's examine the night that permanently changed the character of Nazi anti-Semitism. Decision 4, November 9, 1938. Goebbels decides to unleash Kristallnacht, turning organized violence into state policy on the evening of November 9, 1938. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, made a decision that permanently changed the character of Nazi anti-Semitism and crossed a threshold in the public. Visible persecution of Jewish people that had not been crossed before. Standing before assembled Nazi party leaders at the annual commemoration of the 1923 beer hall putsch in Munich's Old Town Hall, Goebbels gave a speech that the assembled leaders understood as authorization to begin a nationwide, coordinated pogrom against Jewish people, their businesses, and their synagogues. The result was Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, which killed at least 91 Jewish people directly, destroyed approximately 7,500 Jewish businesses, burned or damaged approximately 1,400 synagogues, and resulted in the arrest of approximately 30,000 Jewish men who were sent to concentration camps. The specific trigger that Goebbels used as the pretext for the pogrom was the assassination of Ernst von Rath, a German diplomat in Paris, by Herschel Greenspan, a 17-year-old Polish Jewish refugee whose family had been among the approximately 17,000 Polish Jews summarily expelled from Germany to Poland in late October, dumped at the border with minimal possessions and no arrangements made for their reception. Greenspan, living in Paris and hearing that his family was stranded at the Polish border, went to the German embassy intending to kill the ambassador. He shot the first German official he encountered, who happened to be Ernst von Rath, a junior diplomat who was himself under Gestapo investigation for suspected anti-Nazi sympathies. Von Rath died of his wounds on November 9th. Goebbels' decision to use this assassination as the occasion for a nationwide pogrom was a specific choice rather than an obvious or inevitable response. The assassination of German diplomatic personnel was a serious enough crime that a proportionate response, diplomatic protests, legal action against the specific perpetrator, or targeted restrictions on the specific Jewish refugee community in France would have been comprehensible. A nationwide pogrom against all Jewish people in Germany was a choice of a categorically different order, and the specific character of the decision to organize the pogrom while maintaining the fiction that it was a spontaneous popular uprising, to conduct it through party channels rather than official government orders, to instruct police not to intervene and fire brigades not to extinguish synagogue fires, was a calculated exercise in organized state violence wearing the mask of popular anger. The instructions that went out from Munich on the night of November 9th through the party communications network were specific. SA and SS units were directed to initiate violence against Jewish property. They were instructed to wear civilian clothes to maintain the fiction of spontaneous popular action. The property of non-Jewish Germans was to be protected from damage, and foreign citizens were to be protected regardless of religion. The directive made clear that this was not random violence, but organized action with specific targets and specific limits. The fiction of spontaneity was a deliberate design choice, intended to create political cover for what was actually a coordinated act of state terrorism. The aftermath of Kristallnacht was among the most revealing administrative episodes in the entire pre-war history of the Holocaust. The Jewish community was collectively fined 1 billion Reichsmarks, described as an atonement fine for the assassination in Paris that had supposedly provoked the violence, despite the fact that the assassination was the act of a single 17-year-old and the violent response was organized by the government of the state, imposing the fine. Insurance claims by Jewish business owners for the destruction of their property, which was legitimate under existing German insurance law, were confiscated by the state rather than being paid to the insured, meaning that Jewish people were required by law to pay for the government-organized destruction of their own property. The broken glass of 7,500 shop windows, which represented a significant quantity of expensive imported plate glass requiring foreign currency to replace, was charged to the Jewish community's account. Hermann Göring's response to Kristallnacht, documented in a meeting of senior Nazi officials on November 12, 1938, was furious, not because of the violence or the anti-Semitism, but because of the economic irrationality. He objected to the destruction of Jewish business property because it destroyed economic value that the German state was in the process of confiscating through Aryanization, turning that value into rubble instead of German assets. He reportedly said it would have been better to kill 200 Jews than to destroy so much valuable property. His objection was to the method rather than to the persecution. The international reaction to Kristallnacht was the strongest condemnation of Nazi anti-Jewish policy that the international community had yet expressed. American President Roosevelt recalled the American ambassador from Berlin, a gesture without precedent in the diplomatic relationship with Germany since the Nazi seizure of power. Multiple other countries expressed formal diplomatic disapproval. The press coverage in democratic countries was extensive and condemnatory. The British government issued official protests. The League of Nations discussed the situation. None of this produced any policy change of substance. American immigration quotas were not modified. British policy on Jewish immigration to Palestine was not changed. No economic sanctions were imposed. No military pressure was brought to bear. The pattern that had been established through the Nuremberg laws and through Munich repeated itself. Condemnation without consequence. The lesson received by the Nazi leadership was the same lesson Munich had delivered. Escalation carries no cost beyond diplomatic protest. And speaking of the decision that most fundamentally transformed the Holocaust from persecution to genocide, let's discuss the invasion that changed everything about the scale and character of the murder. Decision 5, June 22, 1941. Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, converting persecution into systematic mass murder. Of all the 25 decisions we examine in this series, the decision to invade the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941 is the one that most fundamentally changed the nature, the scope, and the irreversibility of the Holocaust. Before Barbarossa, the Nazi regime's anti-Jewish policy, terrible as it was, operated primarily through persecution, forced immigration, and the brutal conditions of the occupied Polish ghettos. It killed tens of thousands through neglect, disease, and deliberate starvation, but it had not yet launched the systematic, organized industrial mass killing of millions of people that the word Holocaust now denotes. After Barbarossa, and after the specific criminal orders that accompanied it, the policy became the systematic murder of every Jewish man, woman, and child within the reach of the German military and its killing units. The transition between those two phases of Nazi anti-Jewish policy runs through June 22, 1941. The strategic context of the Barbarossa decision was enormous and complex. Germany had been at war with Britain since September 1939 and had failed to achieve the decisive victory over Britain that Hitler had expected. Britain remained in the war, sustained by American material support that was increasing with every month under the Lend-Lease program. From a conventional strategic standpoint, Opening a second major front against the Soviet Union while Britain remained undefeated was a significant risk. The Soviet Union's territory and resources dwarfed Germany's in almost every category except the quality of military organization and training. A prolonged two-front war was precisely the nightmare scenario that German military planning had historically sought to avoid. Hitler and the senior Wehrmacht leadership convinced themselves and each other that the Soviet Union would not be a prolonged two-front war, but a rapid campaign of 6 to 8 weeks, after which the Soviet state would collapse and its resources would be available to Germany, making it possible to deal definitively with Britain from a position of total continental dominance. This conviction rested on specific assessments of Soviet military quality following the Red Army's poor performance against Finland in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, on intelligence assessments that underestimated the depth of Soviet reserves and productive capacity, and on ideological assumptions about the racial inferiority of the Soviet peoples and the political fragility of the Soviet state that were distorted by Nazi racial theory. The criminal orders issued to accompany Barbarossa transformed it from a conventional military campaign into a war of racial and ideological annihilation from before the first shot was fired. The Commissar Order of June 6, 1941, directed the summary execution of all Soviet political officers captured in combat, explicitly placing them outside the protections of the laws of armed conflict. The guidelines for the behavior of troops in Russia directed that the civilian populations of the occupied territories should be treated with ruthlessness appropriate to the racial character of the conflict, and that the standard legal protections for civilians did not apply. The Wehrmacht senior commanders were briefed on these orders before the invasion began and largely accepted them, some with privately noted reservations and most without. Alongside the military invasion moved 4 Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units organized by the SS and drawn from various SS and police formations, each divided into smaller Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos. Their operational mandate was to kill Jewish people, Soviet political officers, Communist Party officials, and others designated as racial and ideological enemies in the territories the German military was advancing through. In the first weeks of the invasion, the Einsatzgruppen began conducting mass shootings of Jewish men. By August 1941, through a decision-making process that historians continue to debate, they had expanded their killing to include women, children, and elderly people. By the autumn of 1941, they were conducting the systematic killing of entire Jewish communities across Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The scale of the killing that the Barbarossa decision set in motion was staggering. The Einsatzgruppen killed approximately 500,000 people in the second half of 1941 alone. Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev, was the site on September 29th and 30th, 1941 of the killing of 33,771 people in 2 days, the single largest 2-day killing operation in the history of the Holocaust before the death camps reached peak capacity. Rumbula, outside Riga in Latvia, was the site on November 30th and December 8th, 1941 of the killing of approximately 25,000 people. Ponary, outside Vilna in Lithuania, was the site of killings that eventually totaled approximately 70,000 people. These were not the anomalies of an occupation gone wrong. They were the deliberate operational output of units that had been specifically organized, trained, and deployed to conduct mass killing as their primary mission. The Barbarossa decision also brought approximately 3 million additional Jewish people under German control through the conquest of the Baltic states, Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia. This vast expansion of the Jewish population under German authority made the immigration solutions that had been the primary mechanism of the 1930s policy mathematically impossible, and made the ghettoization solutions applied in Poland inadequate for the scale involved. The decision to invade the Soviet Union was therefore simultaneously the decision to make the systematic murder of millions of people the only policy option that the Nazi leadership considered consistent with its ideological goals. And speaking of the decision-making that systematized and coordinated this already ongoing mass murder, let's discuss the meeting where the administrative architecture of genocide was locked in place. Decision 6, January 20th, 1942. Heydrich convenes Wannsee, coordinating the bureaucratic machinery of murder across the entire German state. The Wannsee Conference of January 20th, 1942 is one of the most studied and most written about single meetings in the history of the modern world, and for reasons that go beyond its documentary significance. 15 men gathered at a comfortable villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, a wealthy Berlin suburb whose lakeside setting was selected for its pleasant and businesslike character, and in approximately 90 minutes coordinated the administrative arrangements for the murder of 11 million people. Not the decision to murder them, which had already been made by the most senior levels of the Nazi leadership. Not the initiation of the killing, which had been underway in the occupied Soviet territories for 7 months. But the systematic, bureaucratic coordination of every arm of the German state and the implementation of the genocide, ensuring that the killing would be organized at the continental scale that the Nazi leadership's ambitions required. Reinhard Heydrich, who chaired the conference as chief of the Reich Main Security Office and therefore as the operational head of the SS security apparatus, had originally scheduled the conference for December 8, 1941, but postponed it following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor the previous day and the German declaration of war on the United States that followed on December 11th. These events changed the strategic context of the war significantly, bringing into the conflict against Germany the greatest industrial and economic power in the world. They did not change the decision to proceed with the genocide. The rescheduled conference took place on January 20th, 1942. The participants Heydrich assembled represented the full breadth of the German state's involvement in the genocide's implementation. From the SS came Heydrich himself and Adolf Eichmann, who would serve as secretary and produce the official minutes. From the Nazi Party Chancellery came George Liebrand and Alfred Meyer. From the Foreign Office came Martin Luther. From the Interior Ministry came Wilhelm Stuckert, one of the authors of the Nuremberg Laws. From the Justice Ministry came Roland Freisler, who would later become infamous as the president of the People's Court that tried the July 20th plotters. From the Four-Year Plan Administration came Erich Neumann. From the Office of the Governor-General of Occupied Poland came Joseph Buehler. From the occupation administrations of the occupied Soviet territories came Gerhard Klopfer and Alfred Meyer. The conference was not a secret gathering of the SS inner circle. It was a gathering of senior representatives of the entire civilian and SS governmental apparatus of the German state. The Wannsee Protocol, the official minutes produced by Eichmann and reviewed and edited by Heydrich before distribution, is one of the most important and most revealing documents in the history of the Holocaust. It demonstrates, in the specific bureaucratic language of German administrative documentation, the systematic character of what was being planned. The 11 million Jews of Europe, specifically enumerated by country with their population numbers, are discussed as a logistical problem to be solved through evacuation to the east, labor deployment, and what the protocol calls special treatment, the established euphemism for killing. The protocol describes, with the precision of a planning document, the geographic sequence in which Jewish populations would be addressed, the administrative authorities responsible for each territory, and the principles that would govern the implementation. The discussion at Wannsee that the protocol records was not primarily about whether to commit genocide. That question had already been answered. The discussion was primarily organizational. How to ensure that the SS primary responsibility for the final solutions implementation was acknowledged and respected by all other agencies. How to address the jurisdictional ambiguities that had been creating friction between the SS and the civil administration of occupied Poland. How to handle the specific legal and administrative complications presented by people of mixed Jewish and non-Jewish ancestry. And how to organize the deportation sequences from different parts of Europe in a way that would not create transportation bottlenecks or administrative confusion. The Mischling discussion, the debate about what to do with people of partial Jewish ancestry, was one of the most revealing portions of the meeting precisely because it demonstrated the degree to which the implementation of a racial ideology built on imprecise biological categories, generated genuinely difficult administrative problems. People with one Jewish grandparent or two Jewish grandparents occupied different categories under the existing classification system, and the question of whether first-degree Mischlinge should be killed like Jews or sterilized and left alive created a substantive bureaucratic disagreement that was not resolved at Wannsee and continued unresolved for the remainder of the war. Mass murder was simultaneously being organized and being subjected to the minutiae of classification bureaucracy. The decision that Wannsee most significantly represented was the decision to make the genocide an enterprise of the entire German state rather than primarily an SS project. By bringing together representatives of so many different governmental bodies and securing their understanding and implicit cooperation, Heydrich ensured that the genocide would be embedded in the institutional life of every major arm of German administration. The Foreign Office would handle the diplomatic dimensions of deportation from Allied and occupied countries. The Justice Ministry would ensure that the legal framework permitted the property confiscation that accompanied deportation. The Interior Ministry would manage the administrative aspects of population registration and tracking. The Railway Ministry would schedule the transports. The genocide was not a secret operation confined to the SS. It was a government-wide enterprise, and Wannsee was the meeting that formalized that reality. And speaking of the specific technical and logistical decisions that gave the genocide its industrial character, let's discuss the decision that built the physical infrastructure of mass murder. Decision 7, 1941 to 1942. The decision to build dedicated extermination facilities rather than rely on mobile killing units. Among the most consequential decisions in the organizational history of the Holocaust was the decision, made through a process that historians date to the second half of 1941 and the first months of 1942, to construct dedicated extermination facilities in which the killing of Jewish people could be conducted at a scale, a pace, and a level of operational efficiency that the Einsatzgruppen's mobile shooting operations could not achieve. This decision produced the 6 death camps of the Nazi system: Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, which together were responsible for the deaths of approximately 3 million people. It is the decision that gave the Holocaust its specifically industrial character, and that produced the physical infrastructure whose ruins serve today as the primary memorial sites of the genocide. The Einsatzgruppen model of mobile killing, in which specially organized units followed the advancing German army through the occupied Soviet territories and systematically shot the Jewish populations of the towns and villages they passed through, was operationally effective in the sense that it killed large numbers of people over a wide geographic area relatively quickly. Between June and December 1941, the Einsatzgruppen and their auxiliary units killed approximately 500,000 people. But the model had specific limitations that the SS leadership recognized and addressed. The first limitation was psychological and organizational. The mass shooting operations required large numbers of personnel to be directly and personally engaged in killing, aiming weapons at individual human beings, pulling triggers, managing the logistics of assembling large groups, and processing them through shooting pits. Himmler's visit to Minsk in August 1941, where he observed a mass shooting operation and reportedly had a visible physical reaction of distress, produced his express concern about the long-term psychological welfare of the men conducting the shooting. The concern was genuine, but the response was entirely focused on the perpetrators. Himmler did not consider stopping the killing, but rather finding a method that would be less psychologically demanding for those conducting it. The second limitation was logistical. The Einsatzgruppen model required the physical co-location of large killing units and their targets. As the German military advance slowed and eventually reversed in the Soviet Union through the autumn and winter of 1941, the geographic reach of the mobile killing model became increasingly constrained. More importantly, the enormous Jewish populations of German-occupied Poland, approximately 2 million people concentrated in the ghettos of Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, and hundreds of smaller cities, required a different approach because they were not in territories where mobile shooting operations were being conducted, and because their sheer numbers exceeded what mobile shooting operations could efficiently address. The third limitation was the disposal problem. Mass shooting operations created large numbers of bodies in relatively accessible locations. The mass graves of the Einsatzgruppen operations, many of which were only shallowly buried or were buried in locations known to local civilians, created a persistent evidence problem that the SS leadership recognized even at the time. The bodies in mass graves were potential evidence of crimes, and as the military situation evolved, that evidence would eventually become accessible to the armies that were advancing against Germany. The alternative model that was developed addressed all three of these problems simultaneously. Dedicated extermination facilities, built in fixed locations in German-controlled territory, using gas chamber technology rather than shooting as the primary killing method, and equipped with crematoria for the disposal of bodies, concentrated the killing in environments where the operational parameters could be controlled, reduced the direct psychological burden on most of the SS staff who worked at the facilities without being personally present in the killing process, and addressed the evidence disposal problem through systematic cremation. The operational template was available from the T4 euthanasia program, which had spent 2 years developing and refining gas chamber technology for use in the killing of disabled Germans, and had produced a core of experienced personnel, established supply chains for the killing materials, and proven architectural designs for facilities whose purpose was concealed by their external appearance as medical or sanitary institutions. The suspension of the official T4 program in August 1941 freed this technical and human infrastructure for redeployment to the new facilities being planned in occupied Poland. The first dedicated extermination facility at Chelmno in occupied Poland began operating on December 8, 1941, using gas vans rather than stationary chambers. The three Operation Reinhard camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, were constructed with stationary gas chambers using piped carbon monoxide and began operating in March, May, and July 1942 respectively. Treblinka, the largest of the three, was built specifically to address the Warsaw ghettos population and was designed with a capacity of approximately 15,000 people per day, a killing rate that no mobile shooting operation could approach. The decision to build dedicated extermination facilities was a decision to make mass murder permanent, specialized, and industrial. It embedded the genocide in physical infrastructure that required planning, engineering, construction, and ongoing operational management. It brought into the Holocaust architects who drew blueprints, engineers who designed ventilation systems for gas chambers, construction companies that built the facilities using both free. Decision 8, August 1941. The decision to include women and children in the mass shootings, committing to the total destruction of Jewish communities in the first weeks of the Einsatzgruppen operations following the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. The killing units operated under orders that, while directing them to kill Jewish men of military age along with Soviet political officers and Communist Party officials, did not explicitly require the killing of women, children, and elderly people. Some unit commanders in the earliest phase of the operations did not kill women and children, restricting their operations to adult men. By the end of August 1941, this partial approach had been abandoned across the entire Einsatzgruppen system, and the killing had been extended to every Jewish person regardless of age or gender. The decision that produced this extension, moving from targeted killing of specific categories to the total destruction of Jewish communities, including every child, is among the most morally catastrophic single decisions in the history of the Holocaust. The historiographical debate about exactly when and how this decision was made is one of the most extensively contested in Holocaust scholarship, and it has been so for decades. The intentionalist scholars, who argue that Hitler had a programmatic intention to murder all Jews from an early stage of the Nazi movement, tend to locate the decision in a Hitler order communicated in the summer of 1941, either before the invasion began or early in its execution. The functionalist scholars, who argue that the genocide emerged through a process of institutional radicalization rather than a single top-down decision, tend to see the expansion to women and children as a series of decisions made by individual unit commanders in response to operational pressures and implicit higher-level encouragement, rather than the execution of a single directive. What can be established from the documentary record, including the operational reports filed by the Einsatzgruppen and the testimony of participants collected in post-war proceedings, is the specific timing and the specific context of the expansion. The shooting of entire Jewish communities, including women, children, and elderly people, began appearing consistently in Einsatzgruppen reports in late July and August 1941. The specific triggering factors that historians have identified include Himmler's visit to Minsk in August 1941, at which he expressed concern about the psychological burden on his men and simultaneously communicated the expectation that the killing mandate would be expanded. They also include the operational logic of the units themselves, which had been leaving surviving women and children in communities where the men had been killed and which concluded, through a combination of security rationale and ideological commitment, that leaving this surviving population in place was operationally inconsistent with the mandate they understood themselves to be executing. The security rationale that was articulated in some communications from this period ran as follows. If Jewish men were being killed as potential partisans and security threats, then the women and children who survived the killing of their male relatives were potential sources of partisan support, potential witnesses to the killings who might alert other communities, and potential recruits to the Soviet partisan forces that were organizing behind the German lines. The security logic that had justified killing adult men was therefore extended, step by step, to encompass an argument for killing every member of the community. The argument was specious because the security threat posed by Jewish children was minimal by any rational assessment. But the specious security argument provided a framework within which the expansion of the killing could be rationalized in operational rather than purely ideological terms. The killing operations that reflect the expansion decision are among the most documented and most terrible events in the history of the Holocaust. Babi Yar, on September 29th and 30th, 1941, killed 33,771 people over 2 days, men, women, and children together, in a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev. The operation was conducted by Einsatzkommando 4A with the assistance of Order Police battalions and German Army units, and it was organized with a logistical efficiency that only became possible once the mandate to kill entire communities rather than selected categories had been fully internalized. Ponary, outside Vilna, where killing had been occurring since July, became after August 1941 the site of operations that killed entire families and communities. Rumbula, outside Riga, where 25,000 people were killed in 2 days in late November and early December 1941, was one of the largest operations of this expanded phase. The specific human reality of what the expansion decision produced was that parents were killed alongside children, that infants were killed alongside grandparents, that entire community networks, the teachers and the rabbis and the doctors and the bakers and the children who would have become them, were systematically eliminated community by community across a territory that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The expansion decision did not just increase the number of victims. It changed the character of the genocide from targeted persecution of specific categories to the total destruction of a people, community by community, in a sequence that worked its way across the occupied East with methodical, documented thoroughness. And speaking of the decisions that organized the genocide's implementation at the scale of entire cities, let's discuss the decision that determined the fate of the largest Jewish community in occupied Europe. Decision 9, July 22, 1942. The decision to begin the mass deportation of Warsaw's 400,000 Jewish residents to Treblinka on July 22, 1942, the eve of the Jewish fast day of Tisha B'Av. The German SS and police in Warsaw began what they called the Gross Action Warschau, the Great Warsaw Action. The mass deportation of the Warsaw ghettos, approximately 400,000 residents, to the Treblinka death camp. which had opened the previous day specifically to receive them. The decision to begin this operation, and the specific methods and timeline chosen for it, represented the moment at which the largest single Jewish community in occupied Europe was marked for systematic destruction, and the beginning of a 52-day operation that would kill approximately 300,000 people and permanently transform the character of the Warsaw Ghetto from an instrument of exploitation into a site of active resistance. The decision to begin the Warsaw deportations in July 1942 was made in the context of Himmler's visit to Warsaw in mid-July 1942, during which he reviewed the situation in the ghetto and issued orders for the deportation operations to begin. The timing reflected the operational readiness of Treblinka, which had been constructed in the preceding months on the model of the other Operation Reinhard camps, and which was specifically designed to process the Warsaw Ghetto's population. The railway connection between Warsaw and Treblinka, the capacity of the camp's gas chambers, and the administrative arrangements for organizing the deportations from the ghetto side had all been prepared in advance, and the decision to begin on July 22 reflected the assessment that these preparations were sufficiently complete. The specific mechanism through which the German authorities organized the deportations was the Judenrat, the Jewish Council of Warsaw, which was summoned on July 22 and informed that the entire Jewish population of Warsaw, with the exception of certain categories of employed workers and their immediate families, was to be resettled in the east. The Judenrat was told to provide 6,000 people per day for the resettlement operation, assembled at the Umschlagplatz, the collection point near the ghetto's railway connection. The penalty for failure to provide the daily quota was stated explicitly. The Judenrat's own members and their families would be included in the deportation list. Adam Cherniakow, the Judenrat chairman, had been engaged in negotiations with German authorities about the status and welfare of the ghetto's population for the entire period of the ghetto's existence since November 1940. He had consistently tried to secure protections for as many categories of people as possible, trading compliance with German demands in less critical areas for exemptions in more critical ones. He complied with the initial deportation order and spent the following day attempting to negotiate exemptions for specific categories, particularly children in the orphanages. On the morning of July 23, he received confirmation that there would be no exemption for the children. He returned to his office, wrote 2 brief notes, and took the cyanide capsule he had apparently kept against this eventuality. He died on the afternoon of July 23. The Judenrat that continued under new leadership after Cherniakow's death complied with the deportation demands. The Jewish ghetto police, the Ordnungsdienst, were required to participate actively in the roundup operations, with each officer given a daily personal quota of people to deliver to the Umschlagplatz. The penalty for failure to meet the personal quota was the officer's own deportation. This specific coercive design, requiring members of the victim community to participate actively in organizing the deportation of their community members, was a calculated German administrative choice that reduced the German manpower required while creating moral complexity within the victim community that made organized resistance more difficult. The 52-day deportation operation that followed killed approximately 300,000 people at Treblinka. The specific experience of those deportations has been documented in the diaries, testimonies, and underground reports that the Warsaw Ghetto's remarkable documentary tradition produced and that the Onyx Shabbat archive preserved. The experience was as brutal as the numbers suggest, and more. Families were separated. People selected for deportation were held for days at the Umschlagplatz in summer heat without adequate food or water before being loaded onto sealed cattle cars. The journey to Treblinka took several hours in conditions that killed some before arrival. Those who arrived alive were dead within hours. The decision to begin the Warsaw deportations also triggered the organizational response that would eventually produce the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. 6 days after the deportations began, on July 28, 1942, the Jewish Combat Organization was founded by Mordecai Anielewicz and colleagues from various Zionist youth movements and from the Bund. The ZOB's founding decision, made in the middle of a deportation operation that was killing 6,000 people per day, was to organize armed resistance for the next German attempt to liquidate the remaining ghetto population. The 9 months between the founding of the ZOB and the uprising of April 1943 were spent acquiring weapons through enormous difficulty, organizing the remaining population into fighting units, and preparing the underground infrastructure from which the uprising would be conducted. The deportation decision of July 22nd thus produced both the massive death toll of the summer of 1942 and the armed resistance of April 1943. And speaking of the resistance that specific decisions produced and the decisions that prevented effective international support for that resistance, let's discuss the Allied decision that has generated the most ongoing controversy. Decision 10, summer 1944. The Allied decision not to bomb the Auschwitz railway lines or gas chambers, as the Hungarian deportations killed 10,000 people per day in the summer of 1944, as Allied forces were advancing across France following the successful D-Day landings of June 6. As Soviet forces were conducting Operation Bagration that would destroy the German Army Group Center and advance the Eastern Front dramatically westward, as the outcome of the war had shifted decisively in the Allies' favor, the killing operations at Auschwitz-Birkenau were at their peak throughput, processing approximately 10,000 people per day during the height of the Hungarian deportations. Jewish organizations, the newly established War Refugee Board, and specific individuals within Allied governments repeatedly and specifically requested that the Allies bomb the railway lines carrying Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, or bomb the gas chamber complexes themselves, to disrupt or destroy the killing infrastructure. These requests were refused. The refusals were documented, and the killing continued. The informational context of the decision is essential to understanding its moral weight. By the summer of 1944, the Allied governments had extensive and specific knowledge of what was occurring at Auschwitz. The Verba-Wetzler report, produced by Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler after their successful escape from Auschwitz in April 1944, provided the first detailed eyewitness account of the camp's killing operations from inside, including the specific locations of the crematoria complexes, the daily killing capacity, the procedure for receiving and processing deportation transports, and a detailed description of the gas chamber and cremation process. The report was transmitted to Allied governments through the Jewish Agency and the War Refugee Board by June 1944 and was in the possession of American and British officials as the Hungarian deportations were reaching their peak. Allied reconnaissance photographs of the Auschwitz area, taken during bombing missions against the IG Farben-Bühne plant at Monowitz, approximately 5 kilometers from the Birkenau killing complex, had inadvertently captured detailed images of the Birkenau camp itself, including the crematoria buildings. These photographs were subsequently analyzed by intelligence specialists and confirmed the physical layout described in the Verba-Wetzler report. Allied aircraft were already conducting bombing missions in the immediate vicinity of Auschwitz. The question was not whether Allied air power could reach the area, but whether specific targets within it would be selected. The requests for bombing action were made through multiple channels and with increasing urgency as the scale of the Hungarian deportations became clear. The World Jewish Congress, the Jewish Agency, the War Refugee Board under its director John Pelly, and individual members of Congress and Parliament presented the case for targeting the Auschwitz railway lines and gas chambers. The arguments were specific. The railway lines between Hungary and Auschwitz were within range of Allied bombers already flying missions in the region. Damage to those lines would disrupt the deportation transports and save lives while the lines were being repaired, and the bombing of the crematoria complexes themselves would destroy the primary physical infrastructure of the killing operations. The official responses to these requests were documented in memoranda and correspondence that have been preserved and studied by historians. The American War Department's response, delivered through the Assistant Secretary of War John McCloy, was that the War Department had considered the requests and determined that the proposed bombing was impracticable in view of the military effectiveness of such an operation, and that it would in any case be of doubtful efficacy. The British Air Ministry offered similar reasoning. The distances involved were too great. The precision required was beyond the capabilities of available aircraft, and the diversion of resources from active military operations was not justified by the likely results. Historians have subjected these official justifications to extensive critical analysis, and the consensus is that they did not reflect accurate assessments of what was operationally possible. The claim that the distances were too great was undermined by the fact that Allied aircraft had already conducted missions to the Auschwitz area. The claim that precision was beyond available technology was weakened by the fact that the IG Farben plant at Monowitz, which was bombed by American aircraft on August 20th, September 13th, and December 26th, 1944, was not significantly more difficult a bombing target than the crematoria complexes. The claim that diversion of resources was unjustified did not adequately weigh the specific, documented killing operations that were occurring at the time the requests were being made. The most historically persuasive explanation for the decision not to bomb is a combination of institutional inertia within the Allied military bureaucracies, which had established the principle that strategic bombing resources were to be focused on military and industrial targets, contributing to Germany's warfighting capacity, and a persistent reluctance at senior levels of Allied government to treat Jewish rescue as a military objective warranting specific resource allocation. The War Refugee Board was a very recent creation, established only in January 1944 after years of State Department obstruction of refugee initiatives, and its authority to press military commanders for specific rescue operations was limited. The human consequences of the decision not to bomb are calculable with precision unusual in historical analysis. Between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Approximately 300,000 of them were killed immediately on arrival, within hours of stepping off the trains. The deportations continued at this rate through the period when the bombing requests were being considered and refused. Whether targeted bombing of the railway lines or the crematoria complexes would have saved a significant number of these people is genuinely uncertain and continues to be debated. What is not uncertain is that the decision not to bomb was made with knowledge of what was occurring, with specific requests for action that were refused, and that the killing continued at its maximum rate through the period in question. Let your breathing slow now. Let the weight of these histories press gently down. There are 3 more decisions in Part 1. Let them settle into the space that has been prepared for them. And speaking of a decision that shaped the specific technology of murder at the camp, where most of these hundreds of thousands died, let's discuss the experimental night in Block 11. Decision 11, September 3rd, 1941. The first use of Zyklon B at Auschwitz, selecting the technology that would kill over 1 million people on September 3rd, 1941, in the sealed basement of Block 11 in Auschwitz I, approximately 850 people, primarily Soviet prisoners of war identified as political commissars, along with approximately 250 sick prisoners from the camp's hospital block, were killed using Zyklon B hydrogen cyanide pesticide pellets for the first time as a mass killing agent. The decision to conduct this experiment, made by Auschwitz Deputy Commandant Karl Fritsch in the temporary absence of Commandant Rudolf Haas, was not a decision to begin the Holocaust, which was by that date already 7 months into its Einsatzgruppen phase in the occupied Soviet Union. It was a decision about technology, about which specific method would be used to kill the Jewish people who would be brought to Auschwitz in the subsequent years. In that specific and consequential sense, September 3rd, 1941 was the day on which the technology of the Holocaust's largest single killing site was selected. The context of the first Zyklon B test was the ongoing search within the SS administrative apparatus for killing methods that were more efficient and less psychologically demanding than the shooting operations the Einsatzgruppen were conducting. Fritsch was aware that Zyklon B was already being used at Auschwitz for its commercial purpose, the fumigation of barracks to kill lice and other insects, and had apparently been considering its potential as a killing agent for some time before the opportunity of the September 3rd prisoner group presented itself. Haas was away from the camp that day, and Fritsch proceeded with the experiment on his own initiative. The first attempt was not immediately successful. The initial concentration of Zyklon B pellets introduced into the sealed basement was insufficient to produce rapid death, and when SS personnel checked the following morning, some of the approximately 850 people inside were still alive. Additional pellets were introduced, the space was resealed, and the second attempt produced the result Fritsch had been testing for. All of the people in the basement were dead. Rudolf Haas described his reaction to the results of the first Zyklon B experiment in his post-war autobiography, written in a Polish prison cell before his execution in April 1947, with a quality of clinical observation that is among the most morally disturbing features of the entire perpetrator literature of the Holocaust. He described examining the bodies in the basement, which were crowded together in the positions produced by the gas, and experiencing a sense of relief. The relief, as he described it, was not the relief of a person who found the killing easier than he had feared. It was the relief of a manager who had found a more efficient solution to a logistical problem. He had been concerned about the psychological and organizational burden of mass shooting as a primary killing method. Zyklon B, he concluded, offered a more practical alternative. The decision to proceed with Zyklon B as the primary killing agent at Auschwitz-Birkenau was made in the weeks following the September 3rd experiment, as Haas communicated the results to Himmler and received confirmation that the development should continue. The expansion from the Block 11 basement to the purpose-built gas chambers that were incorporated into the Birkenau crematoria complexes required additional technical development, including the design of the chamber architecture, the pellet introduction system through openings in the roof, and a ventilation system that would clear the chambers of residual gas after each operation before the Sonderkommando prisoners entered to remove the bodies. The technical development of the Birkenau gas chambers involves specific corporate actors whose participation in the genocide is documented in their own business correspondence. The firm of Toff und Sain of Erfurt, which specialized in industrial furnace technology, designed the multi-muffle cremation furnaces for the 4 large crematoria complexes at Birkenau, each capable of processing multiple corpses simultaneously. Company engineers visited Auschwitz multiple times, supervised the installation of their equipment, and communicated with the SS camp administration in the specific technical language of industrial engineering about the throughput capacity and operational efficiency of the killing and cremation infrastructure they were building. The correspondence survived the war and is preserved in archives that document the corporate dimension of the Holocaust's industrial character at its most specific and most damning level. The company that manufactured and supplied the Zyklon B to Auschwitz, Degesch, and its distributing subsidiary Testa, complied with a specific SS request to modify the commercial product by removing the warning odorant additive that was standard in the commercial version. The commercial Zyklon B included a smell additive to alert people to the presence of a gas. For the death camp application, this additive was not wanted, because the purpose was to kill people who should not be aware of the gas until it had reached lethal concentration. The removal of the warning odorant was agreed to and implemented as a business accommodation. It is documented in business correspondence. The people who made the decision and implemented it understood what they were selling and to what application. And speaking of business accommodations that enabled the genocide, let's discuss the diplomatic accommodation that demonstrated to the Nazi leadership that the world would watch the killing without effective response. Decision 12, April 1943. The Bermuda Conference, where Britain and America choose performance over rescue in April 1943, as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was beginning and as the Operation Reinhard camps were killing tens of thousands of people every week. The British and American governments convened a conference in Bermuda specifically to address international pressure for action to rescue Jewish refugees. The conference lasted 12 days, from April 19th to April 30th. Its outcome produced no meaningful change in policy, no new rescue commitments, no modification of the immigration restrictions that were preventing the admission of Jewish refugees to either country, and no substantive engagement with the specific killing operations that were the source of the refugee crisis. The Bermuda Conference was a masterpiece of diplomatic performance in the service of political inaction, and the decision to design it that way was made by identifiable people for identifiable reasons. The political pressure that generated the conference came from multiple sources. Jewish organizations in the United States and Britain had been presenting evidence of the systematic mass murder of European Jews to their governments since the Regner Telegram of August 1942 and the subsequent accumulation of corroborating intelligence. Members of Congress and Parliament were receiving and presenting this evidence in legislative settings and were pressing for specific government responses. The Polish government in exile in London had published and distributed extensive documentation of the killing operations. The specific political objective of the Bermuda Conference, from the perspective of both the British and American governments, was to hold a visible diplomatic event that could be pointed to as evidence that the issue was being addressed, while ensuring that the event produced no commitments that would require changes in either country's immigration or refugee policies. The design of the conference to achieve this outcome was explicit and documented. The conference venue, Bermuda, was selected specifically for its geographic remoteness from Washington and London, which would make it difficult for refugee advocates and press organizations to observe the proceedings directly. The press was excluded from the sessions. Jewish organizations were not invited to present evidence or proposals. The terms of reference under which both delegations were operating were drafted to exclude in advance the policy changes that would have produced meaningful results. The American delegation was instructed not to make any commitment that would require modification of the existing immigration quotas, not to propose any measure that might require pressure on Germany to allow Jewish immigration, and not to suggest any arrangement that might be construed as offering material benefit to Germany in exchange for Jewish lives. The British delegation operated under equally limiting constraints. The specific instruction most critical to the conference's outcome was the British directive that the Palestine question was not to be discussed under any circumstances. The 1939 White Paper that severely restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine was the cornerstone of British Middle East policy, and any modification of the Palestine immigration limits would, in the British government's assessment, jeopardize relationships with Arab governments that were considered strategically essential to British interests in the region. The exclusion of Palestine as a destination for refugees eliminated the most obvious available large-scale refuge for European Jews. The conference's proceedings produced a communiqué that committed the delegations to continue working within existing frameworks, offered no specific new commitments, and addressed the killing operations themselves not at all. The delegations returned to their capitals. The killing operations continued at their existing pace. Several of the participants in the conference who subsequently reflected on it acknowledged, in post-war memoirs and interviews, that the conference had been designed not to produce results and had achieved its design with complete success. The decision to design the Bermuda Conference as a performance of action rather than an action was made by senior officials of two democratic governments with active free presses and functioning legislative bodies whose members were raising the refugee issue. The pressure for action was real. The decision to respond to that pressure with a performance of action rather than action itself was a deliberate choice, made because the political and strategic costs of the specific rescue measures were calculated as higher than the political cost of being seen to do nothing, and because the lives at stake were not those of the officials making the calculation. And speaking of the decisions made by occupied countries that determined whether their Jewish populations lived or died, let's examine the most consequential national cooperation decision in the Holocaust Western phase. Decision 13, March 1944. Hungary cooperates with German occupation, sealing the fate of 437,000 Jews in 56 days when German forces occupied Hungary on March 19, 1944. It was not in the face of Hungarian military resistance, but in the context of a political arrangement in which the Hungarian state essentially accepted the occupation rather than fighting it. Regent Miklos Horthy had been summoned to a meeting with Hitler at Klesium Castle in Austria, ostensibly for diplomatic consultations, and was effectively detained there while German forces crossed the border. He returned to Hungary that evening to find it occupied by German forces and was faced with a choice: accept the occupation and continue as a nominal head of state under German supervision, or refuse and either flee to Allied-controlled territory or be removed from power entirely. He chose to accept, and the consequences of that choice determined the fate of 437,000 people. The Hungarian Jewish community, approximately 800,000 people in the expanded Hungary that included territories annexed from Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia during the war, had survived the first 5 years of the war in conditions that were severely discriminatory, but that stopped short of the deportations and mass killing that had destroyed Jewish communities across the rest of German-controlled Europe. The Hungarian government under Horthy had implemented its own anti-Semitic legislation since 1938, including restrictions on Jewish participation in professions and economic life, and the forced labor service that had killed tens of thousands of Jewish men in brutal military labor conditions. But Hungary had consistently refused German pressure to participate in the deportation system that had killed the Jews of Poland, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and other countries. The German decision to occupy Hungary in March 1944 was driven by military and political calculations primarily unrelated to the Jewish population. Germany needed to prevent Hungary from attempting a separate peace with the approaching Allies as the military situation deteriorated on all fronts, and needed to ensure that Hungarian industrial and agricultural resources remained available to the German war economy in the final phase of the conflict. The Jewish population of Hungary was an additional objective that the German leadership had never abandoned but had been unable to address, while Hungary maintained its nominal independence. Immediately following the occupation, Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest with a team of deportation specialists from the RSHA, and within days the Hungarian authorities were cooperating with the organizational framework for the deportation of Hungarian Jews. The Hungarian administrative cooperation with the German deportation operations was more extensive and more complete than the cooperation the Germans had received from any other national administration in Western or Central Europe. Hungarian police organized the ghettoization of the provincial Jewish population, conducting the roundups that assembled Jews from their homes into designated collection points. Hungarian local authorities managed the administrative aspects of the operation. Hungarian railway officials scheduled and operated the trains that carried the deportees to the border. The scale of Hungarian administrative cooperation meant that the German deportation specialists needed primarily to direct and supervise the operation rather than to staff it directly. The deportations of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau began on May 15, 1944. The pace was extraordinary. 4 to 5 trains per day arrived at Birkenau at the peak of the operation, each carrying thousands of people. The selection platform at Birkenau, the railway spur built directly into the camp and completed just months before to handle this specific operation, operated continuously during the Hungarian deportation period. The gas chambers at Birkenau, which had been running continuously since 1942, were now processing approximately 10,000 people per day, a pace that exceeded even their substantial design capacity and required the supplementation of cremation by burning in open pits beside the crematoria buildings. The decision by Horthy to halt the deportations on July 9, 1944, came after he had received documentation of what was happening at Auschwitz, including the Verbewetzler report that had been transmitted to the Hungarian Jewish leadership and through them to Horthy himself, and after sustained international pressure, including personal appeals from Pope Pius XII, King Gustav I of Sweden, and President Franklin Roosevelt. By the time of the halt, approximately 437,000 people had been deported. Of these, approximately 300,000 had been killed immediately on arrival at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The approximately 200,000 Jews who remained in Budapest at the time of the July 9th halt survived through a subsequent months-long period of danger that included the German-backed Arrow Cross coup of October 1944, which renewed deportation and killing operations, and eventually the Soviet siege and liberation of Budapest in February 1945. Their survival was the product of the halt decision of July 9th, the rescue operations of Raoul Wallenberg, and other neutral country diplomats, and the specific military and political evolution of the final months of the war. The Hungarian case demonstrates with unusual clarity the degree to which national cooperation decisions shaped the specific fate of Jewish communities that the German deportation machinery could not destroy without local administrative support. Denmark's Jewish community survived because the Danish population refused to cooperate and organized rescue. Hungary's provincial Jewish community was destroyed in 2 months because the Hungarian state chose to cooperate actively. Both responses were choices made by identifiable institutions in identifiable circumstances, and the different outcomes they produced were the direct consequence of those choices. Decision 14, July 1942. The WW2 Roundup. France's Vichy government chooses collaboration and includes children. The Germans did not even request a decision by the Vichy French government to conduct the WW2 Roundup of July 16th and 17th. 1942 represents one of the most consequential acts of national administrative cooperation with the Holocaust deportation machinery in Western Europe, and it contains within it a specific detail that is among the most damning facts in the history of French collaboration. The Vichy government chose to include children in the deportation operation even though the German authorities had not specifically requested them. This was not compliance with German demands. In at least one important respect, it was volunteering to do more than the Germans required. The WW2 Roundup was organized by the German SS deportation apparatus under Adolf Eichmann's direction, using the framework that had been established in negotiations between the SS and the Vichy government's interior ministry in the preceding months. The German demand was for the deportation of foreign Jewish people from the German-occupied zone of France, specifically those who did not hold French citizenship. The Vichy government had, in negotiations that preceded the roundup, agreed not only to provide foreign Jews from the occupied zone, but to make foreign Jews in the nominally unoccupied Vichy zone available as well, exceeding what the Germans had required. The specific decision to include children in the roundup was made at the Vichy administrative level rather than being imposed by the German deportation specialists. The German deportation orders at this stage of the operation were focused on adults of working age. Children, as non-workers, were not a German priority for inclusion in transports that were officially described, in the fiction maintained for the Vichy population, as labor deportations to the east. The Vichy Interior Ministry's reasoning for including children was essentially administrative and politically self-interested. Separating children from their deported parents would have created an immediate and highly visible crisis, as several thousand abandoned Jewish children with no parents and no guardians would have required French child welfare services to care for them, creating a public, visible, ongoing reminder of what the deportation operations were doing to families. Including the children in the deportation solved this administrative problem by eliminating it along with the children. The organization of the roundup used French police rather than German forces as the primary operational agents. Approximately 9,000 French police officers participated in the operation across Paris and the surrounding region, working from prepared lists compiled from the registration records that Jewish people had been required to complete under occupation regulations. The use of French police served multiple German purposes. It reduced the German manpower requirement. It gave the operation a veneer of French legal authority that made resistance more complicated, and it embedded the French state visibly and demonstrably in an operation whose full moral character could not be denied. Approximately 13,000 people were arrested in the 2-day operation, including approximately 4,000 children. They were taken to the Velodrome des Havres cycling stadium, a large indoor venue in the 15th arrondissement of Paris, where they were held for 5 days under conditions that were catastrophic. The stadium had no adequate toilet facilities for thousands of people, no adequate food supply, minimal water, and no medical care. It was midsummer. People died in the stadium from heat and dehydration. Some adults took their own lives rather than wait for deportation. Children who had been separated from their parents in the chaos of arrest screamed for them through the days of detention. French Red Cross workers who gained access to the stadium documented conditions that made the venue's purpose unmistakable to any observer. From the Velodrome de Hiver, those arrested were transported to the transit camps at Drancy, Pithiviers, and Bonne-la-Rolande, where they were held before deportation to Auschwitz-Birkenau. In a sequence of events that is among the most documented and most terrible in the French Holocaust, the adults and children who had been arrested together were separated at the transit camps, with parents deported first and children held separately for subsequent deportation. The children who had been taken with their parents were ultimately deported on separate convoys after their parents, transported to Auschwitz, where they were killed immediately on arrival, having had the experience of their separation from their parents and their detention in transit camps added to the experience of deportation and murder. The French government's formal acknowledgement of state responsibility for the WW2 roundup came only in 1995, when President Jacques Chirac made a speech on the anniversary of the roundup that broke with the long-standing official position that the Vichy government had not been the legitimate French state and that therefore the French Republic bore no responsibility for Vichy's actions. Chirac's acknowledgement that France had committed an irreparable act by delivering the people it was protecting to their executioners was the first such formal acknowledgement by a French head of state. It came 53 years after the event it addressed. By that time, most of those directly responsible had died, and those who had survived as children and could testify to what they had experienced were elderly. And speaking of decisions made by national governments that reflected specific political calculations about the value of Jewish lives relative to other considerations, let's discuss a decision made within the German military that embedded criminal conduct in the institutional culture of the Eastern War. Decision 15, June 6, 1941. The Wehrmacht issues the Commissar Order, committing Germany's military to systematic war crimes before Barbarossa begins on June 6, 1941, 16 days before the first German soldier crossed into Soviet territory to begin Operation Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht issued the Commissar Order to its field commanders. The order directed that Soviet political commissars, the political officers attached to Red Army formations at various levels, were to be shot upon capture rather than being treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva and Hague Conventions. This order, issued before a shot had been fired in the campaign it governed, committed the German military to systematic, premeditated war crimes on a specific and categorical basis, and it established the operational framework of a war in the East that would be conducted from its first day outside the laws of armed conflict that governed Germany's campaigns in Western Europe. The Commissar Order was developed through a process that involved both Hitler's political leadership and the senior Wehrmacht military command, and the degree to which the military leadership participated willingly versus under political pressure is a question that the post-war trials addressed and that historians have continued to examine. What the documentary record establishes is that the order was not sprung on the military leadership without notice. Senior commanders were briefed on Hitler's conception of the Barbarossa campaign as a war of racial and ideological annihilation during a series of meetings in the spring of 1941, and the Commissar Order was developed as one of several criminal orders, alongside the Barbarossa Decree, which limited German soldiers' accountability for crimes against civilians, that translated that conception into operational directives. Several senior commanders expressed reservations about the Commissar Order in communications and meetings, some on legal grounds, and more on the practical grounds that it would prevent Soviet soldiers from surrendering, knowing that their political officers would be shot, and would therefore increase the military resistance Germany would face. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock wrote in his diary that he considered the order wrong. Other commanders communicated similar concerns through official channels. These reservations were noted and largely disregarded by the military and political leadership, and the order was issued. The commanders who had expressed reservations then implemented the order, with a small number of exceptions at the level of individual units whose commanders chose not to apply it and were not disciplined for their failure to do so. The Commissar Order's significance for the Holocaust extends beyond its specific application to Soviet political officers. It established the operational culture of the Eastern War as a war outside the law, a war in which the constraints that govern the treatment of enemies and civilians in conventional warfare did not apply. This culture created the environment in which the Einsatzgruppen could operate alongside the Wehrmacht without effective military resistance or obstruction, in which Wehrmacht units could participate in or observe Einsatzgruppen killing operations without those operations being treated as violations of military law, and in which the broader civilian population of the occupied East was subjected to violence and exploitation that would have been impermissible under the laws of war that the Wehrmacht applied in Western Europe. The compliance of the Wehrmacht with the Commissar Order and with the broader criminal directives that accompany Barbarossa has been extensively documented and was one of the central issues of the Nuremberg High Command trial and its subsequent proceedings before German courts. The post-war defense that Wehrmacht commanders had been compelled to comply with criminal orders against their professional and moral judgment was evaluated by the Nuremberg tribunals in the context of the specific evidence that compliance was not universally compelled and that commanders who chose not to implement specific criminal orders were not uniformly punished. The tribunal's conclusion that following clearly illegal orders was not a legal defense, that individual commanders retained personal criminal responsibility for the orders they issued and implemented, became a foundational principle of international military law. The specific connection between the Commissar Order and the Holocaust is that the criminal culture it established in the Eastern War, the idea that certain categories of people were outside the law and could be killed without consequence, was the cultural environment within which the Einsatzgruppen conducted their mass shooting operations. The Wehrmacht and the Einsatzgruppen were not separate worlds in the occupied East. They operated in the same territory, shared logistical support in many areas, and in numerous documented instances Wehrmacht units provided direct assistance to Einsatzgruppen killing operations. The Commissar Order's establishment of a legal free zone for killing in the East was the institutional environment in which the Holocaust's most extensive killing operations took place. And speaking of decisions made by individuals in conditions of impossible moral constraint that nonetheless carried enormous historical weight, let's discuss the most morally complex individual decision in this entire history. Decision 16, July 23, 1942. Adam Chernyakov takes poison rather than provide children for deportation, drawing the one line he would not cross on the afternoon of July 23, 1942, Adam Chernyakov, the chairman of the Warsaw Judenrat who had administered the Jewish community of the Warsaw Ghetto since its establishment in November 1940, died by suicide in his office at 26 Grzybowska Street. He had taken a cyanide capsule. He had been 59 years old. The specific circumstances of his death, the specific decision that made his suicide the response he chose rather than any other available response, are documented in two brief notes he left and in the accounts of colleagues who had been with him in the hours before his death. Chernyakov had spent the morning of July 23rd engaged in his characteristic mode of operation, negotiating with German authorities to secure exemptions from the deportation orders that had begun the previous day. He was seeking to protect specific categories of people from the daily quota of 6,000 that the Germans required him to provide to the Umschlagplatz. He sought and received partial assurances about specific groups, workers in certain designated enterprises, members of specific institutions. He was working, as he had been working for 2 years, within the framework of accommodation and negotiation, trying to reduce the harm caused by German orders he could not refuse. On the morning of July 23rd, he received confirmation of what he had been trying to prevent from the previous day's negotiations. There would be no exemption for the children. The orphans in Janusz Korczak's orphanage, the children in the other welfare institutions the Judenrat maintained, the children whose parents were deportation victims, but who had themselves been excluded from the initial roundups, all of them were to be included in the deportation quotas. He had spent the morning specifically trying to secure a children's exemption. He did not receive it. He wrote a note to the Judenrat, brief and not extensively elaborated. He wrote that he was unable to hand over helpless children. He wrote that his heart trembled with sorrow and compassion. He took the cyanide capsule. He died in his office. The moral analysis of Chernyakov's decision is one of the most extensively conducted and least conclusively resolved moral analyses in the entire literature of the Holocaust. The central question that historians, philosophers, and survivors have asked is whether his suicide was the morally appropriate response to an impossible situation, or whether a different response might have served the ghetto's population better. The case for his suicide as an appropriate response is grounded in the specific moral claim it made, that there was a line he would not cross, a category of compliance he would not provide regardless of the consequences to himself. He had complied with German demands for 2 years in the calculation that continued compliance was the best available strategy for preserving the maximum number of lives. When the demand crossed the specific threshold of the children, he withdrew his compliance in the only way available to him, by removing himself from the equation. His death was not an effective intervention in the deportations, which continued without him, but it was a specific, personal moral statement that has been recognized by subsequent generations as a form of moral integrity in the face of impossible choices. The case against his suicide as the most effective response focuses on the alternatives he did not take. He could, at the moment of receiving the order about the children, have left his office and publicly announced to the ghetto what the German authorities were demanding, providing the ghetto population with the clearest possible information about the true purpose of the deportations. He could have attempted to flee to the Polish side of the ghetto wall, where his status as the Warsaw Judenrat chairman might have generated international attention to his account of what was happening. He could have organized a public act of resistance that, while likely resulting in his death in any case, would have communicated a message to the ghetto population different from the quiet death in his office. These alternatives all carry their own uncertainties and their own likely fatal outcomes. They might or might not have changed anything for the ghetto's population. What is certain is that the specific choice Chernyakov made, the private death in his office, communicated his refusal to comply in a way that the ghetto population received only through the news of his death, not through any public statement that might have changed the population's understanding of their situation. Emanuel Ringelblum, who had observed Chernyakov's 2-year chairmanship with a mixture of sympathy for the impossible position and criticism of specific decisions, wrote about the suicide with more generosity than he had typically shown toward Judenrat conduct. Chernyakov, he wrote, had atoned through his death for many things. The specific act of drawing a line at the children, of refusing with his life rather than with continuing compliance, was recognized by Ringelblum and by subsequent scholarship as a form of moral statement that transcended the individual circumstances of July 23, 1942. And, speaking of moral statements made in conditions of impossible constraint, let's discuss the decision made 6 days later by a different set of people facing the same impossible situation with a different response. Decision 17, July 28, 1942. Mordecai Anielewicz and his colleagues found the Jewish Combat Organization, choosing to fight 6 days after the mass deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto began, 6 days after approximately 36,000 people had been loaded onto trains and sent to Treblinka, where they were immediately killed. A group of young men and women from the Zionist youth movements of Warsaw and from the Bund, the Jewish Socialist movement, met and made a decision. They founded the Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, the Jewish Combat Organization, the ZOB. They decided that when the Germans returned to complete the liquidation of the remaining 55,000 people in the ghetto, they would fight. The circumstances of this founding decision were desperate to a degree that makes the decision itself remarkable. The ZOB had no weapons. It had perhaps a few dozen members on the day of its founding. The people who formed it were young, most of them in their early 20s, educated in the Zionist youth movement tradition of ideological debate and cultural activity rather than in combat. The German force that was killing 6,000 of their community members per day was a professional military and police organization with armored vehicles, automatic weapons, and the full operational support of the German state. The asymmetry of force was total. Mordecai Anielewicz, who became the ZOB's commander, was 22 years old on the day the organization was founded. He had been a leader of Hashomer Hatzair, the left-wing Zionist youth movement, since before the war, and had spent the occupation years traveling in disguise across occupied Poland, attempting to organize and coordinate between different communities and bringing back intelligence about conditions in different areas. By the summer of 1942, he had a clearer picture than most of what the deportations actually meant. He had received reports from survivors of Treblinka. He understood with unusual specificity and unusually early that the trains were not going to labor camps in the east, but to a place where everyone was killed immediately. The decision to found the ZOB was made against the advice of the older leadership of the ghetto's established political and community organizations. The Judenrat, the welfare institutions, and many of the ghetto's community leaders argued that armed resistance was suicidal and would bring overwhelming German reprisals against the entire remaining ghetto population. These arguments were accurate in their predictions. The uprising of April 1943 did result in the complete German destruction of the ghetto, including the burning of buildings block by block and the death of most of the remaining inhabitants. The argument against resistance was not wrong about what armed resistance would cost. What the argument against resistance failed to account for was what the absence of resistance was also going to cost. The 300,000 people deported in the summer and autumn of 1942, before the ZOB was in any position to mount organized resistance, were killed without the ghetto mounting any coordinated armed response. The outcome for the ghetto's population without resistance was the same as the outcome with resistance, with the exception of the 27 days of fighting in April 1943 that the ZOB's decision produced. The specific calculation that Anilewicz and his colleagues made, explicitly and consciously, was that the difference between dying as the victims of murder and dying as the fighters of an uprising mattered, both for the people doing the dying and for the historical record that would remain after them. The 9 months between the ZOB's founding in July 1942 and the uprising of April 1943 were spent in the acquisition of weapons, which was the primary operational challenge. The Polish underground, the Army of Krajowa, was cautious and limited in its willingness to arm Jewish fighters, providing a small number of pistols and grenades in response to extended negotiation. Individual ZOB members purchased weapons on the black market at enormous prices. Workshops within the ghetto manufactured homemade grenades from limited available materials. By April 1943, the ZOB had approximately 500 fighters with a total arsenal that included approximately 700 pistols, 17 rifles, 1 submachine gun, and a supply of hand grenades. With these weapons against the SS force that entered the ghetto on April 19, 1943, the ZOB produced an uprising that lasted 27 days, drove the SS back on the first day of the operation, inflicted casualties on the German forces, and forced the German commander Jürgen Stroop to escalate to the systematic burning of the ghetto, building by building, to drive the fighters from their positions. Anilewicz died on May 8, 1943, in the command bunker at 18 Mila Street, when German forces pumped poison gas through ventilation openings. He was 23 years old. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising became and remains the most widely known act of Jewish armed resistance in the Holocaust, and its symbolism has been recognized in the specific form of the WW2 Memorial in Warsaw, dedicated on the 5th anniversary of the uprising in 1948, which stands at the center of what is now the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. The decision that produced the uprising made 6 days into a deportation operation that was killing 6,000 people per day by a 22-year-old with no weapons and almost no followers, stands as the founding act of organized Jewish armed resistance in the Holocaust, and as one of the most documented decisions of moral courage in the entire history of this catastrophe. And speaking of moral courage and the decisions that enabled or prevented rescue, let's discuss a decision whose consequences shaped the Allied government's knowledge and response to the Holocaust. Decision 18, August 1942. The American State Department suppresses the Regner telegram, blocking the most important early warning of the final solution on August 8, 1942. Gerhard Regner, the Geneva-based representative of the World Jewish Congress, transmitted through the American diplomatic mission in Geneva a telegram addressed to Rabbi Stephen Wise of the American Jewish Congress in New York, reporting information from a source described as a German industrialist of considerable prominence with connections to the highest levels of the Nazi regime. The telegram stated that a plan was under consideration at the highest levels of the Nazi government for the extermination of all Jews in German-occupied Europe by prussic acid after mass deportation to the east. Regner's source was Eduard Schultz, the managing director of a major German mining company who had access to senior Nazi officials and whose information proved, in its general outline, to be accurate. The telegram was the first communication through diplomatic channels from a source with inside knowledge of the Nazi regime that described the final solution explicitly as a plan for total extermination of European Jews. The American State Department's response to the Regner telegram was to suppress it. Officials at the State Department received the telegram, recognized its significance, and decided not to forward it to Rabbi Wise, its intended recipient. The decision was not made by a single official acting alone, but reflected the institutional culture of the State Department's European Affairs Division, which was led by Assistant Secretary Breckinridge Long, a career diplomat with personal attitudes toward Jewish people and Jewish immigration that his private diary reveals were deeply hostile, and with professional attitudes toward refugee policy that consistently prioritized the maintenance of existing restrictions over humanitarian response to the evolving crisis. The specific mechanism of the suppression was bureaucratic delay and selective information management. The State Department did not formally refuse to transmit the telegram. It simply declined to forward it to Wise, using the standard bureaucratic tools of processing delay and institutional discretion to prevent the information from reaching its intended recipient. Long and his colleagues justified the decision internally on the grounds that the information was unconfirmed and too extreme to be passed on without verification. The real concern, which the subsequent investigation of the Treasury Department documented extensively, was that forwarding the telegram would generate political pressure for refugee admission policies that Long and his colleagues opposed. The British Foreign Office had also received the Regner telegram through its own diplomatic mission in Geneva, and its response was different from the State Department's. British officials forwarded the communication to the British Jewish community, and through that channel, the information eventually reached Rabbi Wise in New York by a roundabout route several weeks after the American suppression had prevented him from receiving it through the official channel. Wise, on receiving the telegram, sought a meeting with State Department officials to discuss its contents and was persuaded to hold the information from the public pending an official American investigation that, the State Department assured him, would be conducted. The investigation the State Department conducted was documented in retrospect by the Treasury Department officials who subsequently investigated the State Department's conduct. The investigation consisted primarily of sending cables to American diplomatic missions in occupied Europe requesting confirmation of the reported extermination program. Missions that were in occupied territory and that were not positioned to investigate SS killing operations in any meaningful way. When the missions reported that they could not confirm the reports, the State Department used this result as evidence that the reports were unverified. The State Department then sent, in February 1943, a cable to the American diplomatic mission in Bern instructing it to stop transmitting further reports from private Jewish organizations, a cable that was specifically intended to cut off the channel through which Regner's information had reached Washington. Treasury Department officials, led by Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. and his counsel Randolph Paul, discovered this cable in December 1943 during their investigation of State Department conduct. The internal document they produced, titled Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews, concluded that State Department officials had suppressed information about the Holocaust, had deliberately obstructed rescue proposals, and had engaged in a pattern of intentional actions and inactions whose practical effect was to prevent any rescue operations from being organized. Morgenthau presented a version of this report to President Roosevelt in January 1944, and Roosevelt responded by creating the War Refugee Board through executive order on January 22, 1944. The specific consequences of the suppression of the Regner telegram in August 1942 are calculable in terms of time lost. Between the suppression of the telegram in August 1942 and Roosevelt's establishment of the War Refugee Board in January 1944, 17 months elapsed during which the State Department's obstructionism prevented effective American government engagement with the Holocaust's rescue dimensions. During those 17 months, the Operation Reinhard camps killed approximately 2 million people. The Wannsee Conference coordination was implemented across Western Europe. The Warsaw Ghetto was liquidated. The Hungarian deportations had not yet begun, which means that there was a population of approximately 800,000 people for whom, if the War Refugee Board had existed from September 1942 rather than January 1944, the specific rescue operations it subsequently organized might have been available earlier and in more developed form. And speaking of the decisions within occupied countries that shaped the Holocaust-specific implementation, let's discuss a decision that embedded the victim community in the machinery of its own destruction. Decision 19, 1942. The decision to require Jewish ghetto police to fill deportation quotas, engineering complicity within the victim community among the most deliberately constructed and most morally devastating aspects of the Holocaust's administrative design in the occupied Polish ghettos was the decision, implemented consistently across multiple ghettos and most extensively in Warsaw during the summer of 1942, to require the Jewish ghetto police, the Ordnungsdienst, to participate actively in the deportation roundups that sent their community members to the death camps. This was not a policy that emerged accidentally from the German occupation's administrative arrangements. It was a calculated design choice whose purposes were multiple and whose consequences extended through every dimension of ghetto life. The practical purposes of the decision were straightforward and documented in the German administrative reasoning of the period. The deportation operations in Warsaw required the daily assembly of 6,000 people at the Umschlagplatz collection point. Conducting this operation using German forces alone would have required a much larger German military and police presence than was available or desired in Warsaw, where German manpower was committed to multiple other priorities. Using the Jewish ghetto police to conduct the roundups reduced the German requirement to a supervisory and enforcement role, with the actual physical work of identifying, collecting, and moving people to the assembly point performed by approximately 2,000 Jewish police officers. The coercive mechanism that enforced Jewish police participation was specific and brutal. Each officer was assigned a daily personal quota of people to deliver to the Umschlagplatz. An officer who failed to meet his personal quota would, along with members of his immediate family, be added to the deportation list. The threat was credible and was enforced on officers who fell short of their quotas. The design placed every officer in the position of choosing between delivering their community members to deportation and being deported themselves along with their families. It was a calculated use of coercion designed to generate the maximum individual compliance with a minimum direct German intervention. The consequences of this design for the social fabric of the ghetto were severe and extended far beyond the direct operational impact on the deportation process. The knowledge that the Jewish police were participating in the roundups created a dynamic of suspicion and betrayal within the ghetto that undermined the community solidarity that had been one of the population's primary survival resources. People avoided contact with police officers they had previously known. Informers and blackmailers used the vulnerability of those trying to avoid deportation. The boundary between the community and the occupying authority became complicated and contested in ways that made collective resistance more difficult. The moral analysis of the Ordnungsdienst members who participated in the deportation roundups has been one of the most contested dimensions of Holocaust ethical history. The range of individual conduct was wide. Some officers used whatever authority their position provided to protect specific people, warning them in advance of roundup operations in their neighborhood, removing names from deportation lists, providing false work papers, using their access to the process to create opportunities for specific individuals to avoid deportation. Others participated with a compliance that exceeded what strict adherence to the quota requirement demanded, using the opportunity to settle personal disputes or to take bribes in exchange for protection that was not within their authority to provide. The majority occupied a morally complex middle ground, doing what was required by the coercive system while making whatever small accommodations their circumstances permitted. Primo Levi's concept of the gray zone, developed in The Drowned and the Saved based on his analysis of the moral landscape of Auschwitz, applies directly to the Ordnungsdienst situation. Levi argued that the Nazi system was specifically designed to create situations in which clear moral categories of perpetrator and victim broke down, in which the victims were placed in positions where any available choice involved some degree of complicity in the system that was killing them, and in which the straightforward application of ordinary moral standards to the choices made in these situations was inadequate and potentially unjust. The Ordnungsdienst officers who delivered their neighbors to deportation in order to avoid their own deportation occupied precisely this gray zone. Their conduct was morally compromised. It was also the product of a deliberate design by the German occupation that was intended to produce that moral compromise. And speaking of deliberate German design choices that shaped the Holocaust-specific character, let's discuss the decision that attempted to erase the physical evidence of what was being done. Decision 20, 1942 to 1944. Action 1005. The decision to destroy the mass graves and eliminate the evidence of the shootings as early as the spring of 1942, while the Einsatzgruppen mass shooting operations in the occupied Soviet territories were still producing new victims daily. The leadership of the SS was already concerned about the physical evidence those operations were creating. The hundreds of mass graves containing the remains of millions of people across Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia represented an enormous body of physical testimony to what had been done in those territories, testimony that the SS leadership understood would eventually be accessible to the armies advancing from the east and would constitute evidence of crimes for which they expected, eventually, to be judged. The decision to attempt to destroy this evidence, through the operation that became known as Action 1005, was made by Himmler and assigned to Assist Standard Paul Blobel, who had commanded the unit responsible for the Babi Yar massacre and who now became the director of the attempt to conceal its evidence. Blobel received his assignment from Himmler in June 1942 and spent the remainder of 1942 and early 1943 developing the methodology and beginning the implementation at specific sites. The approach he settled on was consistent across the multiple sites where it was implemented. Squads of Jewish prisoners, brought to the killing sites under armed guard, were forced to exhume the bodies, arrange them on grates made from railway track sections and timber, and burn them. The bone fragments that survived the burning were crushed and scattered. The pits were filled and the surface was cleared of evidence. The implementation of Action 1005 at Babi Yar, the site outside Kiev where 33,771 people had been killed in 2 days in September 1941, is among the most extensively documented episodes of the evidence destruction program. Blobel returned to Babi Yar with a team of approximately 329 Jewish prisoners from the Sieritz concentration camp in late September 1943, the second anniversary of the original massacre. The prisoners were brought to the ravine and began the exhumation and burning work. They worked at gunpoint, surrounded by guards, aware that their own deaths were intended to follow the completion of their assignment. Among those 329 prisoners, an escape was organized. Using tools from their work and matches they had concealed in their clothing, they planned to break during the night of September 29, 1943, the precise second anniversary of the Babi Yar massacre. They used their tools to break the chains securing their quarters, started fires to create distraction and illumination, and attempted to break through the enclosure in the darkness. Approximately 329 people made the attempt. Approximately 15 survived the pursuit that followed and eventually survived the war to testify to what they had witnessed. The remaining 314 were killed in the hours following the escape attempt. The Babi Yar prisoners' revolt was not an isolated act of spontaneous desperation, but a planned operation conducted by people who understood their situation with clarity and who chose resistance over waiting for the death that was certainly coming. Their testimony, provided by the 15 survivors in the years after the war, is among the most important specific accounts of the evidence destruction program and is the primary source for the detailed documentation of what was done at Babi Yar in the autumn of 1943. The overall Action 1005 program was never completed. The pace of the Soviet advance through 1943 and 1944 outran the evidence destruction effort in many areas, leaving mass graves undisturbed and the physical evidence of the killings accessible to Soviet investigators who documented them methodically. At the Operation Reinhard camps in occupied Poland, the evidence destruction was more successful. Treblinka was plowed under and replanted with crops and a farmhouse. Sobibor was demolished and obscured. Belzec was covered over and subsequently built upon. But the documentation, the Einsatzgruppen operational reports, the Jaeger report with its specific kill counts, the administrative correspondence of the SS camp system, survived in multiple copies in archives across Germany and the occupied territories. The perpetrators could destroy much of the physical evidence, but could not destroy the paper trail their bureaucratic culture had compelled them to create. The failure of Action 1005 to complete its mission of evidence destruction is one of the reasons the Holocaust is the most thoroughly documented genocide in human history. The perpetrators' own records, which they could not fully destroy in time, are the primary evidentiary foundation of everything we know about how the Holocaust was planned, organized, and implemented. And speaking of the decisions that produced accountability for those plans and that organization, let's discuss the most consequential post-war decision in this series. Decision 21, July 1944. Raoul Wallenberg decides to go to Budapest, choosing active rescue over safe neutrality in the early summer of 1944, as the Hungarian deportations were killing approximately 10,000 people per day at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The War Refugee Board in Washington was searching for a suitable person to send to Budapest on a rescue mission. The candidate, identified through the suggestion of Swedish banker Jacob Wallenberg, whose cousin Raoul was recommended for the assignment, was a 31-year-old Swedish businessman with no diplomatic experience, no intelligence background, a mid-level position in his family's import-export business, and no particular conventional qualification for a rescue mission in a country under German occupation. He was approached, briefed on the situation he would be entering, and offered the assignment. He accepted. The decision Raoul Wallenberg made when he accepted the War Refugee Board's assignment was a decision to enter voluntarily into one of the most dangerous situations available to a citizen of a neutral country in the summer of 1944. Hungary was under German occupation. The Arrow Cross, Hungary's native fascist movement, was armed, violent, and aligned with the German authorities. The German SS under Eichmann was running a deportation operation of unprecedented efficiency. The Soviet advance that would eventually reach Budapest was still months away. A Swedish citizen in Budapest had diplomatic protection that would be meaningful only as long as Germany and Hungary chose to respect it, and that protection would evaporate entirely if either government decided it was inconvenient. Wallenberg knew these things when he accepted the assignment. He arrived in Budapest on July 9, 1944, the same day that the Hungarian regent Horthy halted the deportations under international pressure. The approximately 200,000 Jews remaining in Budapest had been spared the provincial deportations, but their safety was far from certain. The Arrow Cross was conducting random violence against Jewish people in the capital. The German authorities had not abandoned their intention to deport Budapest Jews, and the political situation was evolving rapidly as the German military position in Eastern Europe deteriorated. Wallenberg's primary operational tool was the Swedish Schutzpass, the protective passport that he issued to Hungarian Jews claiming Swedish diplomatic protection for the holder. The Schutzpass had no formal basis in international law. Sweden had no legal authority to extend diplomatic protection to Hungarian citizens. The document Wallenberg created was elaborately formatted, bearing the blue and yellow of the Swedish flag, official-looking stamps, and an authoritative signature, and it was presented with a confidence and an insistence that frequently induced German and Hungarian officials to accept it as a document they were required to respect, even though no international law required them to do so. The specific rescue operations that Wallenberg conducted went well beyond issuing documents. He drove personally to the railway stations and deportation assembly points, distributing Schutzpass to people who were about to be loaded onto trains, arguing with German and Hungarian officers about the legal status of the people he was claiming Swedish protection for, physically removing people from deportation columns and marching them to Swedish protected buildings while German guards watched without intervening. He rented and designated as Swedish diplomatic territory approximately 32 apartment buildings in Budapest, each bearing Swedish flags and Swedish diplomatic insignia, and filled them with Jewish people sheltering under a diplomatic immunity that was as much theater as law, but that saved lives because the German and Hungarian authorities chose not to test it directly. His operations in Budapest continued until January 17, 1945, when Soviet forces had completed the liberation of the Pest side of the city and Wallenberg was summoned to the Soviet military headquarters of the commanding marshal. He went willingly, believing he was being called to discuss post-war reconstruction of the Jewish community of Budapest. He was taken into Soviet custody and never publicly released. The Soviet government, when pressed by Swedish diplomatic inquiries about his fate, initially denied knowing anything about him, then produced a report in 1957 stating that he had died in a Soviet prison in 1947 from heart failure. Subsequent Soviet archival releases and the testimony of former Soviet prisoners who encountered him in the Gulag have suggested that this account was false and that he may have survived until a later date under different circumstances. The specific truth of what happened to Raoul Wallenberg after January 17, 1945 has never been fully established. The number of people Wallenberg saved is estimated by different historians and organizations at between 20,000 and 100,000 people, with most careful estimates in the range of 30 to 40,000. He received honorary citizenship from the United States in 1981, from Canada in 1985, from Australia and Israel. Streets, schools, and institutions across the world bear his name. He accepted an assignment that could have been refused, conducted a rescue operation under conditions that required extraordinary personal courage and ingenuity, and then disappeared into the Soviet system that he had walked toward believing it represented safety. And speaking of the decisions that determined how those who committed the Holocaust would be held to account, let's discuss the choice that created the framework of international criminal law. Decision 22, August 1945, the Allied decision to hold the Nuremberg trials, creating international criminal law from the Holocaust evidence in August 1945. The four Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, signed a London Agreement establishing the International Military Tribunal that would conduct the Nuremberg trials. The decision to hold trials rather than to execute Nazi leaders summarily, to imprison them indefinitely without legal process, or to release them into custody of the new German state, was not a foregone conclusion. Substantial debate within Allied governments had considered all of these options, and the trials were chosen for a combination of principled and pragmatic reasons that shaped the Holocaust's legal and historical legacy in ways that persist to the present day. The principal advocate for trials within the American government was Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who argued on both principled grounds and practical ones that summary execution without trial was inconsistent with the values for which the war had been fought and would deny the historical record the benefit of the evidentiary process that a proper trial would produce. The principal opponent within the early American deliberations was Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, who favored a more summary approach for the most senior Nazi leaders, a position that reflected his view that the Nazi leadership had placed itself outside the framework of civilization and did not deserve the protections that civilization's legal processes offered. Winston Churchill at various points favored summary execution of captured Nazi leaders, arguing that the decision had already been made that they should be killed and that a trial was simply an elaborate and potentially risky way of arriving at a predetermined conclusion. The decision for trials prevailed, and the International Military Tribunal was established with a charter that created the legal categories under which the defendants would be charged. The charter established 3 categories of crimes: crimes against peace, specifically the planning and waging of wars of aggression; war crimes, violations of the laws and customs of war; and crimes against humanity, murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population. The category of crimes against humanity was new in international law, specifically created by the London Agreement to address the Holocaust and the T4 program and other systematic atrocities that the Nazi regime had committed against populations that included its own citizens. Its creation was itself a major development in the history of international human rights law. The legal objections to the Nuremberg trials were genuine and were acknowledged by the prosecuting powers. The retroactive application of the newly created categories of crimes against humanity and crimes against peace violated the principle of nullum crimen sine lege, no crime without prior law, which is fundamental to the Western legal tradition. The defendants were being charged with crimes under categories that did not exist as legal categories at the time the actions charged were committed. The response that the tribunal and its defenders offered was that the crimes were so egregiously wrong, so obviously. Decision 23. The 1950s. West Germany's decision to minimize Holocaust education and the generational consequences in the years immediately following the Second World War. The new Federal Republic of Germany faced a choice about how to integrate the history of the Nazi period, including the Holocaust, into the national educational curriculum that would shape the understanding of an entire generation of German citizens who had been children or had not yet been born during the events in question. The decisions made in the late 1940s and through the 1950s about this educational integration were, with significant regional variation across the federal states that controlled educational policy, largely characterized by minimization, contextual framing that reduced the Holocaust to a smaller element in a broader narrative of war and political extremism, and in some regions by near-complete omission of the Holocaust-specific character and scale from the curriculum entirely. The political context in which these educational decisions were made was one in which the West German political and social establishment included a very high proportion of people who had served the Nazi state in various capacities, who had personal and professional interests in minimizing the public profile of the Nazi period, and who were in positions of authority over the educational institutions whose curricula were being designed. A study of West German judges and prosecutors in the 1950s found that a substantial majority had been Nazi Party members or had served in roles connected to the Nazi legal system. A comparable pattern existed in the educational administration, in the university faculties that trained teachers, and in the editorial boards of the publishers who produced the textbooks that would be used in schools. The specific ways in which the Holocaust was minimized in early West German education have been documented by educational historians, including Peter Reichel. The treatment of the Nazi period in textbooks of the late 1940s and 1950s tended to present the Nazi leadership as a small group of criminals who had misled and deceived the German people, minimizing the degree of popular knowledge and participation. The specific character of the Holocaust as a systematic genocide targeting Jewish people specifically was often framed in ways that merged it with other wartime suffering, reducing the distinctive moral character of the genocide by contextualizing it within a broader narrative of general wartime violence and victimhood. The political crisis that eventually changed German Holocaust education was triggered by a series of external events rather than by internal educational reform momentum. The wave of anti-Semitic incidents in the winter of 1959 to 1960, in which swastikas were painted on newly dedicated Holocaust memorials across West Germany and anti-Semitic graffiti appeared on synagogues, demonstrated the degree to which an entire school generation had been inadequately educated about the Nazi period. The Eichmann trial of 1961 brought detailed, specific, nationally broadcast testimony about the Holocaust into German homes through television coverage for the first time, providing information that the school curriculum had not provided. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965 brought specific evidence about the Auschwitz operations into German courts and newspapers. The student movement of the late 1960s represented the generational reckoning that the educational decisions of the 1950s had postponed rather than prevented. The generation of Germans who were in their 20s in 1968 turned on their parents and demanded the specific accounting of what the older generation had done and known and participated in that the educational system had not provided and that the post-war social consensus had discouraged. The cultural revolution that this generational confrontation produced, including a transformation of how the Nazi period and the Holocaust were taught in German schools, was the belated consequence of the educational decisions that had deferred that confrontation for 20 years. And speaking of the decisions that shaped the longer-term transmission of Holocaust memory, let's discuss the two final decisions in our series, both of which concern the ongoing work of restoring what the Holocaust attempted to permanently erase. Decision 24, 1953. The Knesset establishes Yad Vashem, making the recovery of victims' names a national and ongoing obligation in 1953, 8 years after the Holocaust end and 5 years after the establishment of the State of Israel. The Israeli parliament, the Knesset, passed the Yad Vashem law, establishing the Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Authority as a permanent state institution. The institution's name comes from the book of Isaiah, chapter 56, verse 5, in which God promises to those who have no children, who cannot perpetuate their name through descendants, a monument and a name within my walls, better than sons and daughters. Yad Vashem means, literally, a monument and a name. The choice of this specific name for the institution was a statement of its core mission: to give back to each of the Holocaust victims the specific individual identity, the monument and the name that the genocide had attempted to permanently erase by reducing them to a category, then a number, then ash. The decision to establish Yad Vashem as a national institution in 1953 was made in a specific political and social context within Israel. The early years of the Israeli state had seen a complicated relationship between the new society and the Holocaust survivors and its memory. The Zionist movement's central ideological narrative emphasized the transformation from the passive victim of diaspora persecution to the active, self-defending Israeli citizen. And this narrative created a cultural discomfort with the Holocaust imagery of mass victimhood that sometimes expressed itself in ways that were painful to survivors. Some early Israeli discourse described the Holocaust victims in terms that implied passivity or failure that contrasted unfavorably with the image of the fighting Israeli. Survivors sometimes found that speaking about their experience was socially unwelcome in a new society eager to build a forward-looking identity. The Yad Vashem law represented a decisive institutional rejection of this discomfort. By establishing a government-mandated authority specifically tasked with documenting the Holocaust and preserving the memory of its victims, the Israeli state made a specific commitment. The victims of the Holocaust would be remembered as individuals. Their names would be recovered and recorded, and this recovery would be an ongoing state obligation rather than a private or community matter. The institution that was established in 1953 has, in the decades since, become the world's largest Holocaust remembrance and research center, maintaining archives of more than 220 million pages of documents related to the Holocaust, a collection of approximately 467,000 photographs, approximately 15,000 testimonies on film and in other media, and a library of more than 100,000 books on Holocaust-related subjects. The core project of Yad Vashem, the central database of Shoah victims' names, is the institutional expression of the founding decision's core commitment. The database collects pages of testimony, standardized forms on which survivors, family members, and researchers record the names and biographical details of Holocaust victims, and has recovered the identities of approximately 4.8 million of the estimated 6 million Jewish victims. The remaining approximately 1.2 million victims are those for whom no one has yet been able to provide documentation, whose specific individuality has been most completely lost to the killing process that eliminated them along with everyone who knew them. The work continues. New pages of testimony are submitted regularly. New archival sources are being processed. New survivor interviews are conducted by Yad Vashem researchers and by affiliated institutions, including the USC Shoah Foundation, which has collected more than 55,000 video testimonies in a separate but complementary effort. As the generation of direct survivors dies, the archive of their testimonies becomes the primary record of what they witnessed and experienced, and the responsibility for maintaining and expanding that archive passes to the generations who inherit it. And speaking of the inheritance of this history and what that inheritance requires, let's reach the final decision in our series. Decision 25, every day. The decision about what to do with this knowledge and the ongoing choice between memory and forgetting, the 25th decision we examine in this series, is the only one that is still being made. It is being made right now, by you, by everyone who engages with this history, by the institutions and governments and communities that determine how much space the Holocaust occupies in education, in public culture, in the allocation of resources for preservation and research, and in the application of its lessons to the political and moral challenges of the present. It is the decision about what to do with the knowledge that 24 specific historical decisions, and hundreds more like them, produced the Holocaust. Every generation that inherits the knowledge of the Holocaust faces a version of this decision, and the form it takes changes as the distance from the events increases. For the generation of direct survivors, the decision was primarily about whether and how to speak, whether to attempt to communicate to a world that was unprepared to fully receive the testimony they were carrying. Many survivors chose silence, at least initially, protecting themselves from the re-traumatization of constant repetition and protecting their new communities and families from knowledge that was too heavy for ordinary social life. Many eventually chose to speak, driven by the sense that the obligation to witness required their testimony to be given while they were alive to give it. Both choices were legitimate responses to an impossible position. For the generation of survivors' children, the decision took the form of how to relate to a history that was present in their family life, but often not spoken about directly, a history whose weight was felt in their parents' silences, their nightmares, their hypervigilance, their inability to speak casually about certain things that other families spoke about without difficulty. The children of survivors have, as a generation, done more than any other to recover and transmit the specific individual accounts of their parents' experiences, conducting the interviews, writing the memoirs, establishing the organizations, creating the films and the literature that have made the Holocaust-specific human texture more rather than less present in public consciousness as the direct survivors have died. For the generation of survivors' grandchildren, and for all of us who are 2 or more generations removed from the events themselves, the decision is primarily one about engagement rather than personal transmission. It is the decision about whether to know this history in the specific, documented, uncomfortable detail that it requires to be known, rather than in the abstract, manageable summary that allows it to be acknowledged without being fully absorbed. It is the decision about whether the lessons of the Holocaust are being applied to the moral and political challenges of the present in ways that reflect genuine understanding rather than performative commemoration. The specific lessons that the 25 decisions examined in this series teach are not primarily lessons about exceptional evil or exceptional good. They are lessons about ordinary mechanisms operating under specific conditions. Hindenburg's appointment of Hitler was not made by an unusual person. It was made by a conservative aristocrat pursuing the standard political calculation of using a dangerous populist to advance a conservative agenda, a calculation that elites have made in various forms in many countries in many eras. The Wannsee Conference was not conducted by psychopaths. It was conducted by senior government officials applying standard bureaucratic methods to a logistical problem, with the specific moral content of what they were planning filtered out by the euphemistic language and the administrative framing that made it feel like any other planning meeting. The Bermuda Conference was not designed by unusual cowards. It was designed by experienced diplomats pursuing the standard political objective of managing domestic pressure while avoiding substantive commitments, with the specific cost of that management falling on people who were not at the table and whose lives were not those of the people making the calculations. These mechanisms, the willingness to manage dangerous movements by incorporating them, the bureaucratic normalization of morally extreme policies, the diplomatic performance of concern without substance, the systematic suppression of information that would generate uncomfortable political pressure, the calculation of strategic interests that consistently devalues the lives of those without power to press their own claims. These are not unique to the specific historical moment of Nazi Germany. They are present in various forms in human political and institutional life across history and across the world today. Recognizing them in the extreme case of the Holocaust is a way of recognizing them in the ordinary cases of the present, where they are less dramatic, less fully visible, and therefore in some ways more dangerous. The decision about what to do with the knowledge that this history provides is made individually and collectively, in private and in public, in the classroom and in the legislature and in the voting booth. It is made each time someone encounters Holocaust denial and decides whether to engage with it or to walk past it. It is made each time an institution with responsibility for education decides how much of its curriculum to devote to this history and how rigorously to teach it. It is made each time a government decides whether the framework of international human rights law, built directly on the Nuremberg precedents and on the moral lessons of the Holocaust, is worth defending and applying, or whether strategic convenience justifies letting it erode. The 25 decisions examined in this series produced the Holocaust. The 25th decision, made every day by everyone who inherits the knowledge of those 24, will determine what the Holocaust lessons actually mean for the future. That is the decision whose outcome is not yet determined. That is the decision that remains, and that will remain, in human hands. And with that, we have reached the end of 25 decisions inside the Holocaust that changed history forever. 25 specific, documented, consequential moments when the scale and character and irreversibility of the genocide changed because specific human beings made specific choices. Some of those choices were made by the architects of the genocide. Some were made by the governments that stood aside. Some were made by the individuals who tried to stop it. Some were made by the victims themselves, in conditions of impossible constraint. And one is still being made by all of us. Let us sit for a moment with what these 25 decisions, examined together, reveal. They reveal that the Holocaust was assembled, not inevitable. At every decision point we have examined, the alternative existed. Hindenburg could have refused. The Western powers could have held Munich's line. The Wehrmacht commanders could have rejected the Commissar order. The Vichy government could have protected rather than deported. The Allied governments could have bombed the Auschwitz railway lines. The State Department could have forwarded the Regner telegram. Hungary could have resisted rather than cooperated. At every point, the decision that was made was a choice among alternatives, and the choosing of differently would have changed what followed. The Holocaust was not determined. It was decided. They reveal that the Holocaust required participation far beyond the SS. The railway officials and the corporate managers, the diplomatic service and the judicial system, the national police forces and the local administrations, the neutral country banks, and the international relief organizations that failed their mandates. All of these contributed through specific decisions, made by specific people for specific reasons, to the conditions in which the genocide was possible, was organized, and was conducted. The genocide was not a SS project that the rest of the world observed. It was an enterprise that required the participation or the acquiescence of an enormous range of institutions across many countries. And the decisions that produced that participation or that acquiescence were made by ordinary people in ordinary institutional frameworks. They reveal that resistance was possible. Adam Cherniakov's refusal, Mordecai and Neil Wick's uprising, Raoul Wallenberg's rescue operations, the Danish population's boats across to Sweden, the village of Lutschamben-sur-Lignen sheltering thousands of refugees over years, Kurt Gerstein attempting to warn the world, The Bobby or prisoners breaking through the fence on the anniversary of the massacre. These were not the actions of superhuman heroes. They were the choices of ordinary people who decided, in specific circumstances, that the alternative to action was morally unacceptable and who found ways to act within their constraints. The mechanisms that made rescue possible were not categorically different from the mechanisms available to those who chose not to rescue. The difference was in the choice. They reveal, most uncomfortably, that the mechanisms of the Holocaust are recognizable mechanisms rather than unique aberrations. The political miscalculation of Hindenburg and von Papen, the institutional radicalization of the Nazi bureaucracy, the diplomatic performance of action without substance at Bermuda, the bureaucratic suppression of unwelcome information, the corporate participation in atrocity for economic benefit, the national cooperation with occupation demands for strategic reasons, the post-war prioritization of reconstruction over accountability. These patterns exist in various forms in human institutions beyond the specific historical moment of the Third Reich. Recognizing them, there requires no unusual perceptiveness. Recognizing them in the present requires exactly that. The 25 decisions we have examined tonight produce the Holocaust. They are in the past. They cannot be unmade. But the moral obligations they create are not in the past. They are the obligation to understand the Holocaust with the specificity and the honesty it demands, to resist the comfort of treating it as unique, as the product of uniquely German evil, as a historical aberration that belongs safely in the past, to recognize the mechanisms it employed in the institutional and political life of the present, to make, in our own contexts, the decisions that lead toward accountability and humanity rather than toward the complicity and silence and strategic calculation that enabled what we have discussed tonight. The 6 million who were murdered by the decisions in this series deserve the honesty of that recognition. Their names are being recovered, one by one, by the work that began with the founding of Yad Vashem and that continues in archives and research centers across the world. Their lives, before the decisions that ended them, were as full and specific and irreducible as any human life. They deserve to be known not only as statistical victims of historical forces, but as what they actually were, specific people who lived in specific places, who loved specific other people, who had specific skills and specific habits, and specific ways of moving through a world that was taken from them by choices that could, in principle, have been made differently. Their memory is an obligation. The understanding of the decisions that killed them is the only kind of memory that carries moral weight. And the application of that understanding to the present is the only kind of memorial that does anything more than commemorate. Sleep well tonight, carrying these 25 truths with you into the dark. Let them be what they are, the record of what human beings decided, and the reminder that the deciding is never done. Good night.